Thaddeus Rusk didn't even look up from his ledger when he said it. He just kept writing, his pen scratching across the page, like the children weren't standing 3 feet away, like Eleanor wasn't watching him through the crack in the door, with her breath held so tight her chest ached. "The Halverson farm will take the boy," he said to Silas. "Strong enough to work. The little one, Pearl, the Connolly woman, wants a young child she can shape. $7. The other girl, Elsie, goes to the laundry house in Mineral Creek. She's old enough to fold and carry." Silas nodded, writing it down. "What about Eleanor?" Thaddeus finally looked up. His expression didn't change. "She's 13. Capable. I'll find someone who needs a household manager before winter." He turned the page. "Separate them before the end of the month. Easier that way. Children who stay together make trouble. If this story already has your heart pounding, you're exactly where you're supposed to be. Subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications so you never miss what happens next. Every week we bring you stories that will make you hold your breath, feel your chest tighten, and remind you what real courage looks like. And after you subscribe, drop a comment below and tell us the name of your city or country. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to Eleanor. She pulled back from the door before he could see her. Her hand went over her mouth. Not to cry, she wouldn't let herself cry. Not yet, not here, not where he might hear her, but to keep the sound locked inside her chest, where it couldn't escape and ruin everything. Separate them before the end of the month. She stood in the hallway of her uncle's house, with her back against the wall, and the sound of Thaddeus's pen still scratching through the wood, and she counted to 10 in her head the way her mother had taught her when she was small and the thunder came and she was afraid. 1, 2, 3, Milo was in the yard, Elsie was upstairs. Henry had fallen asleep in the chair by the window after supper, and Pearl hadn't let go of Eleanor's skirt since their mother's funeral 3 months ago. 4, 5, 6, $7 for Pearl. 7, Eleanor's jaw tightened until her back teeth ached. She had known something was wrong. She had known it the way you know a storm is coming, even before the sky changes color. Something in the air goes different. Something in the way a person's eyes move when they think you're not paying attention. Thaddeus Rusk had kind words at the funeral. He had stood at the grave beside her and said he would take care of them, all of them. That family was family, and the children of his sister were his own now. Eleanor had been 12 when her father died. 11 months later, her mother followed. Consumption, the doctor said, though toward the end, Eleanor suspected her mother had simply decided she was done. She had promised herself she would not fall apart. She had not. She went back down the hall on quiet feet and found the kitchen empty and stood at the window, looking out at the yard, where Milo was dragging a length of rope across the dirt, making a game out of it for himself the way 10-year-old boys do when there's nobody to play with and too much silence around them. He didn't know. He was just a boy with a rope and a yard and a fading afternoon. Eleanor watched him for 30 seconds. Then she went to find the flour sack. She spent that night planning, not crying, not grieving, not lying awake, staring at the ceiling the way she'd done every night since her mother's coffin went into the ground. Planning. The kind of thinking that leaves no room for anything soft. She had watched her mother run a household on almost nothing, and she had watched her father stretch $1 until it nearly screamed. She knew what food kept and what spoiled. She knew how far a person could walk in a day if they rested properly and drank enough water and didn't panic. She had lived in Red Hollow long enough to know the countryside west of town flattened out into empty grassland, with creek beds and cottonwood stands that provided cover if you knew where to look. She knew where to look. Her father had taken her riding every summer she could remember. She went through the pantry after midnight, moving by memory and touch, not daring a lamp. Cornmeal, dried beans, 2 tins of salt beef, a jar of molasses, hard biscuits wrapped in cloth. She took what she could carry without emptying shelves in ways Thaddeus would notice in the morning. She found a water flask on the back hook by the door. She found an old blanket folded at the bottom of the linen chest in the hall, moth-eaten at one corner but thick enough to matter. She laid it all in the flour sack. Then she sat down on the kitchen floor in the dark and thought about what she was doing. She was 13 years old. She had 4 children to keep alive. The youngest was 3 and still nursing a rag doll she refused to let out of her sight The next youngest was 5 and prone to falling down. Elsie was 7 and sharp enough to understand more than Eleanor wanted her to, and not quite old enough to manage what she understood. Milo was 10 and strong, and would try to carry more than he should, and would not want to admit when he was tired. They had nowhere to go. Eleanor sat on the cold kitchen floor and stared at the wall she couldn't see. Then she thought, nowhere to go means everywhere is possible. She got up. She woke Milo first, because he was the one who would argue. She put her hand over his mouth before his eyes were open, waited until the panic in them settled into recognition, then leaned down and spoke directly into his ear, so low she could barely hear herself. We're leaving. Tonight. All of us. Don't talk, don't ask questions, just get your boots and the coat from the hook. Milo grabbed her wrist. Why, he breathed. I'll tell you when we're out. Eleanor, Milo, she looked straight at him in the dark. He's going to sell us. To different people. Separate farms. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Milo lay very still. Then he got out of bed. Elsie didn't fight. She went pale and silent, and pulled Henry by the hand before Eleanor could reach him, which was exactly what Eleanor had hoped she would do. Henry asked where they were going in a voice too loud, and Elsie put her finger against his lips, with an authority Eleanor hadn't known her 7-year-old sister possessed. Pearl was the problem Eleanor had expected. Pearl woke from deep sleep into confusion, and her face crumpled toward a wail, and Eleanor was on her knee with her arms around her before the first sound came out, holding her tight, rocking her, pressing her lips against Pearl's hair and saying nothing, just making the sound that wasn't words, the low hum that sometimes worked when Pearl was frightened in the night. It took 4 minutes. Eleanor knew because she counted. Then Pearl was quiet, clinging, her face pushed into Eleanor's shoulder, the rag doll crushed between them. They went out the back. The first night was the hardest. Henry fell twice before they reached the creek, and the second time he scraped his palm badly enough to bleed and he cried, silent. Hitching sobs that he tried to hide from Eleanor, because she had told them all to be quiet, and Henry was the kind of child who tried very hard to do what he was told, even when it cost him something. Eleanor tore a strip from the bottom of her underskirt and wrapped his hand and kept moving. By the time false dawn came, they were 2 miles out of Red Hollow, moving along the creek bed where the soft ground muffled footsteps and the cottonwood groves broke up the sight lines from the road. Eleanor had the flour sack over one shoulder and Pearl on her hip, and Pearl wasn't light anymore. 3-year-olds who'd been walking for a year were heavier than they looked. She didn't put Pearl down. They rested for an hour at sunrise behind a stand of brush, out of the wind, and Eleanor rationed out biscuits and a careful measure of water, and nobody complained. Even Pearl, who was old enough to be difficult about food, took what she was given and ate it without a word. Milo sat beside Eleanor, while the others dozed and looked out at the empty country ahead. How far are we going? He asked, his voice rough with exhaustion and the effort of keeping it even. Far enough, Eleanor said. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have right now. Milo was quiet for a moment. What if they come looking? They will come looking. What do we do? Eleanor looked at the horizon, pale and flat and enormous and completely indifferent, to 5 children with a flour sack and nowhere particular to go. We don't let them find us. Milo nodded slowly, like this was a reasonable plan, which it wasn't, but he was 10 and he needed something to hold on to, and Eleanor was what he had. Okay, he said. Get some sleep. I'm not tired. He was asleep in 6 minutes. Eleanor didn't sleep. 6 days. That was how long it took before the food ran so low that Eleanor began halving portions, then halving them again, watching the children's faces for the particular hollowness that meant the hunger was past uncomfortable and moving toward something worse. She had never been truly hungry before. Her family had been poor by some measures, but they had always eaten. She had no frame of reference for this, for watching Henry's ribs become visible under his shirt, since for seeing Pearl stop fussing about the rag doll because she lacked the energy for it. The country they moved through was mostly empty. They passed one farmstead on the second day, and Eleanor steered them in a wide arc around it, moving them through a shallow gulch and back out the other side. She didn't know if Thaddeus had sent riders yet. She assumed he had. He wasn't the kind of man who lost things without a response. She was right, though she didn't know how right, until the 4th day when she spotted dust rising from the road a mile north and pulled everyone flat into a dry wash until it passed. 4 riders, moving fast, heading west along the road. She lay in the dirt beside Pearl and counted her own heartbeats until they were gone. Then she stood up, brushed the dust off Pearl's dress, helped Henry to his feet, and kept walking. On the 5th day, Elsie stopped asking when they would stop. Eleanor noticed this and did not say anything about it. She just kept her hand on Elsie's shoulder as they walked and felt how thin that shoulder had gotten in 6 days and tried to think clearly. They were running out of road in every practical sense. The beans were gone, the cornmeal was almost gone. The salt beef had finished on day 4. What remained was less than a day's food for 5 people if she stretched it to its limits. She couldn't keep them moving like this. She had known it since the 3rd day, if she was gas-buying honest, but knowing it and admitting it were different things, and she had needed the distance from Red Hollow before she could afford to admit anything. She needed shelter. She needed food. She needed something she had been too stubborn to name until now: help. The cottonwoods appeared on the afternoon of the 6th day. A stand of them along what had been a creek in wetter years, the bank carved deep with old water cuts now dry and filled with loose sand and gravel. Good cover. Shade. The ground was soft enough to rest on without stones digging into bones. Eleanor brought them in under the trees and told everyone to sit. Nobody argued. Pearl climbed directly into Milo's lap and closed her eyes. Henry sat down in the dirt and stayed there. Elsie leaned against a tree and her head dropped forward almost immediately. Eleanor looked at them. 5 of them had walked out of Red Hollow with 20 pounds of supplies and 6 days of fear, and they were still here. Still together. She told herself this. She told herself this several times. Then she stood at the edge of the cottonwoods and looked out at the grassland and thought about what came next with the same deliberate focus she had been using to suppress everything else. All the grief and exhaustion and the specific terror of being 13 years old with 4 lives depending on the quality of her decisions. She heard the horse before she saw it. He came from the south, following a line that cut across the open country the way riders did when they were heading somewhere in particular and not interested in the road. A single horse, a roan, moving at an easy walk. The rider sat loose in the saddle, not careless, Eleanor noted, but comfortable in the way of someone who had spent so much time on horseback that a horse was simply another part of him. She didn't retreat. She should have retreated. Every instinct she'd developed in 6 days of running said get back under those trees and don't let yourself be seen. But instinct has limits and judgment sometimes overrides it, and what Eleanor's judgment told her, in the 4 or 5 seconds she had to make a decision, was this. A man riding alone in open country with no riders visible behind him was not Silas Bran. He wasn't riding to find them. He was just riding. She stepped out from the cottonwoods. She put herself between the rider and the trees, between him and the children behind her, and she planted her feet in the dirt and waited. The roan slowed. The rider pulled up about 20 yards out. She could see him more clearly now, older, somewhere past 35, lean in the face and steady in the eye. He wore a plain coat, dusty from the trail, and he held the reins loosely in one hand and looked at her with an expression that was not threatening and not soft but simply careful. The way a person looks when they're not sure what they've found, but they're willing to find out. His name was Gideon Crowley. She didn't know that yet. She just knew he was looking at her and waiting. "Please," Eleanor said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. She was grateful for that. She had not been sure it would. "Please, don't tell them we're here." Gideon Crowley looked at her. Then he looked at the cottonwoods behind her, where she was very aware 4 children were either asleep or watching with wide eyes. And then he looked back at her, and she could see him adding things up, calculating the shape of whatever situation he had ridden into. He opened his mouth to respond, and then he looked up. Beyond her, past the cottonwoods, toward the ridge to the north. Eleanor turned. 3 riders had broken the skyline. They were moving fast, not searching, not casting back and forth the way riders do when they're looking for sign. They were moving with direction, with certainty, the way men move when they already know where they're going. Eleanor recognized Silas Bran's posture before she could make out his face. She recognized the horse. Her stomach dropped through the ground. She turned back to Gideon, and there was nothing calculated left in her face, nothing steady. Just the raw, unvarnished truth of it, everything she'd been holding back for 6 days surfacing at once in a way she couldn't stop. "Please," she said again. It came out differently this time. "Younger, please." Gideon looked at her for 2 seconds. 2 seconds is a long time when everything depends on the answer. Then he spoke. "Get them into the wash," he said. "Low and quick and even. The deep one, east side of the trees. Get flat and stay flat. Don't make a sound, no matter what you hear." Eleanor stared at him. "Go," he said, not harsh. Just certain. She went. She got Elsie up first because Elsie was the easiest. One touch and Elsie was awake, and reading Eleanor's face and moving without being told twice. Henry came up confused and protesting, and Elsie grabbed his arm and they were moving. Eleanor had Pearl, still half asleep, draped over her shoulder and the rag doll dangling from Pearl's fist, and she had Milo by the back of his collar, because Milo was trying to look back at the rider instead of moving. "Move," Eleanor said. "Who is he? I don't know. Move." "Eleanor Milo." She kept her voice below a whisper but put everything she had into it. "Trust me. Walk." He walked. The wash Gideon had pointed toward was a channel cut 4 feet deep into the creek bank, sand-bottomed and narrow. Eleanor dropped into it first and caught Pearl, and then reached up for Henry, and then they were all in, flat on the sand in various degrees of consciousness and confusion. And Eleanor had one arm over Pearl and one hand pressed flat against Henry's back to tell him without words to stay down. She listened. Hoofbeats. 3 horses moving fast, then slower as they came down off the ridge. The particular rhythm of horses pulling up. A voice. Silas Brand's voice. "Hey there, you see any kids come through here?" 5 of them. The oldest is a girl, 13, dark hair. A pause. Gideon's voice was even and unhurried. "Kids, no, I haven't." "You sure? We've been tracking them out of Red Hollow 6 days. This is right about where the trail starts going sideways." "Haven't seen anybody," Gideon said. "Been out here all morning." Milo turned his head and looked at Eleanor. His eyes asked the question his mouth couldn't. Eleanor shook her head. "Don't move." "You running cattle out here?" Silas asked. "Checking fence. My spread is 3 miles south." "Crowley?" "That's right." A silence. Eleanor tried to hear everything in it, suspicion, calculation, the particular sound of a man deciding whether he believed what he was being told. "These kids belong to Thaddeus Rusk," Silas said. "He's their guardian. We just want to bring them home." "I understand," Gideon said. "I'd help you if I'd seen something to help with." Another silence. Then hoofbeats, moving away, north and west, back along the ridge line and down the other side until the sound faded into the ordinary sounds of wind and distance. Nobody in the wash moved. Eleanor realized her hand was shaking. She pressed it flat against the sand and made it stop. Pearl pushed her face up from the sand and looked at her with eyes that were red-rimmed from 6 days of not enough sleep. "Elle," she whispered. "Shh," Eleanor said softly. "We're okay." "Are we?" Milo asked. He wasn't being contrary about it. He genuinely wanted to know. Eleanor listened for another 30 seconds. "Nothing. For now," she said. Gideon came to the wash edge 10 minutes later and looked down at them. His expression hadn't changed much from when Eleanor had first seen him. He had the kind of face that didn't shift easily, not because nothing was happening behind it, but because he had decided a long time ago that he wasn't going to let everything that was happening behind it come out onto his face. "They're gone," he said. "West Ridge Road, heading toward Mineral Creek." Eleanor sat up. She helped Pearl first, then stood and looked up at him. "You lied to them," she said. "I did. Why?" Gideon looked at her for a moment. Not calculating. Not deciding whether to answer. Just looking, the way a person looks when they're finding words for something they've already decided. "You're a child," he said. "That man was Silas Brand. I've known about Silas Brand for long enough to know what he is." He paused. "I didn't need any more reasons than that." Eleanor studied him. She was exhausted down to the layer below bone. She had been suspicious of every adult she'd encountered in the past 6 weeks, and she didn't intend to stop being suspicious now, just because a stranger had done her one good turn. Good turns had conditions attached to them. She knew this the way you know something that's been demonstrated rather than explained. "We're not going back," she said. "I didn't say you were." "I don't know you." "No," Gideon said. "You don't. He looked at the 4 children arranged in the sand below him and then back at her. You have food? Almost none. Water? Half a flask. He was quiet for a moment. My ranch is 3 miles south, he said. I have a cook stove and 6 bedrooms and enough food to last through the summer. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm just telling you what I have. What do you want in return? The question came out harder than she'd intended. She watched him to see if it offended him. It didn't seem to. Nothing, he said. But I expect you don't believe that. No, Eleanor said. I don't. That's fair. He looked at Pearl, who had her face pressed into Eleanor's side and was watching him from the corner of one eye, with a suspicion that was almost comical in a 3-year-old. How far has she been walking? 6 days. How much of it did she walk herself? More than she should have, Eleanor said. She's been in my arms most of it. Something moved across Gideon's face, gone as fast as it came. Come south with me, he said. 1 night. Just 1. You can leave in the morning if you want. I won't stop you. Eleanor stood in the dry wash, with 4 children behind her, and the flour sack containing what remained of their supplies, which was approximately nothing, and she looked at this man she didn't know, and she weighed every variable she had. He'd lied to Silas Bran. He hadn't hesitated. He hadn't looked back at the trees in a way that telegraphed what was hidden there. He hadn't tried to bargain with her or explain himself beyond what was necessary. He had a cook stove, he had 6 bedrooms, he had food. 1 night, she said. 1 night, he agreed. Milo was already climbing out of the wash. The ranch house was not what Eleanor had expected, though she couldn't have said exactly what she had expected. It was a working ranch house, and it showed it the kind of place that has been maintained carefully but without vandaddy, where things are fixed when they break and replaced when they wear out, and nobody has thought much about how it looks, because there's been too much to do to think about that. A low porch. A solid door. Windows that were clean, which she noticed because it was the detail that told you something that someone had cared enough to keep them clean, even when there was no particular reason to. It was a barn 50 yards back and a long, low structure beyond it that was probably a bunkhouse. An old man emerged from the barn as they came through the gate, white-haired, deliberate in his movements, with the permanently weathered face of someone who had spent 50 years looking into wind. Caleb, Gideon said, these young folks are going to stay tonight. Caleb looked at the 5 of them. I'll put beans on, he said, and went back into the barn for something, and that was all. Eleanor filed this away. A man who doesn't ask questions is either trustworthy or dangerous. She had decided by the end of the evening that Caleb Finch was trustworthy, which was based primarily on the way Pearl fell asleep against his knee after supper, while he sat in the chair by the fire, saying nothing in particular, not drawing attention to it, just letting it happen. Supper was beans and cornbread and a pot of stewed beef, and Eleanor didn't tell the children to pace themselves, because she didn't have the heart to, and they ate like people who had been walking 6 days on almost nothing, which was what they were. Henry ate 2 plates and then fell asleep sitting up and had to be carried. Pearl ate 1 plate and then pressed herself against Caleb's knee and was gone. Elsie ate and then sat quietly, watching everything with eyes that took in more than Eleanor was comfortable with in a 7-year-old. Milo ate and then looked at Gideon across the table. Why do you live alone? He asked. Eleanor opened her mouth. Gideon raised one hand, slightly not dismissing her, just indicating he would handle it. I didn't always, he said. My wife died. And my son. About 5 years ago, Milo processed this. What were their names, Margaret? And Samuel? How old was Samuel? 4. Milo looked down at his plate and then back up. That's the same as Henry. I know, Gideon said. Another silence. The fire made the only sound. I'm sorry, Milo said. Not the polite way adults say it. The actual way. Gideon nodded once. Thank you. Eleanor sat back and looked at the house around her. The clean windows. The solid walls. The bedrooms upstairs with actual beds in them, which she knew because Gideon had shown them while the stew was cooking. Matter of fact, here's where you'll sleep. And she had stood in the doorway of the room with the 2 beds and looked at the quilts and the pillow and felt something she didn't have a name for, something between relief and grief and something else that wasn't either. 6 bedrooms. 5 of them had been empty. She thought about that as she helped Caleb clear the supper dishes while Gideon carried Henry upstairs and Milo carried Pearl, who had not woken at all. One night, she had said, she stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the dark grassland beyond the fence line. She told herself one night. She almost believed it. She woke at 2 in the morning with the particular alertness of someone who has been sleeping lightly for 6 days and heard something different. Nothing was wrong. That was what was different. There was no wind through canvas, no stones under her hip, no sound of 4 children breathing in the cold open air. There was a quilt and a mattress and a window with moonlight coming through it, and from somewhere, down the hall, barely audible, the sound of Pearl making the small sounds she made when she was dreaming something confusing. Eleanor lay on her back and stared at the ceiling. She thought about Thaddeus Rusk's pen scratching across the ledger page. $7 for Pearl. She thought about Silas Brand's voice above the wash, "We just want to bring them home." She thought about one night. She thought about what Milo had said, how old was Samuel? 4, the same as Henry, and she thought about Gideon's face when Milo said it, the thing that had moved across it and then been put away again. She got up. She moved down the hall without a lamp and stopped at the top of the stairs and listened to the house. Quiet. The specific quiet of a house with people in it, which is different from the quiet of empty. She sat down on the top stair and wrapped her arms around her knees. One night, she had said. The problem with one night was that Silas Brand now knew the direction they'd been moving. The problem with one night was that Pearl had slept without crying for the first time in 6 days. The problem with one night was that Henry, when Gideon carried him upstairs, had put his head on Gideon's shoulder with the trusting thoughtlessness of a very young child who has decided without evidence that a person is safe. The problem with one night was that Eleanor was 13 years old, and she did not know what she was doing, and she had been pretending otherwise so hard and for so long that the pretending had become indistinguishable from the real thing, and she wasn't sure anymore which was which. She sat on the top stair in the dark. Down the hall, Pearl made another small sound, and then quiet, and Eleanor put her head down on her knees and, for the first time since her mother's coffin went into the ground, let herself cry. Silently, without witnesses, in the dark of a stranger's house with her family sleeping safe for one night around her. She gave herself exactly 5 minutes. Then she wiped her face on her sleeve, stood up, and went back to her room. Tomorrow she would decide what came next. Tonight, for now, they were safe. And that was enough. Except she already knew, somewhere below thought, below planning, below all the calculations she'd been running for 6 days, like a machine that wouldn't stop. She already knew one night was not going to be enough. She just wasn't ready to say it yet. She told herself one night. She told herself this again in the morning, when she came downstairs and found Caleb already at the stove and the smell of coffee, and fried cornmeal filling the kitchen, and Henry sitting on the floor beside the woodbox talking to himself in the me. Private language of 5-year-olds while Caleb moved around him without complaint, stepping over him twice without looking down, which was a thing Eleanor noticed, because it was the kind of small accommodation that either came naturally to a person or didn't come at all. She told herself one night while she ate breakfast and watched Pearl climb down from her chair and walk directly to the window to look at the barnyard like she owned it. She told herself one night right up until Milo came in from outside with mud on his boots and said, "Gideon's got a fence post down on the south line, and the cattle are pushing at the gap," and then looked at Eleanor and said, "I told him I could help," and Eleanor opened her mouth to say, "No, we're leaving this morning. We had an agreement and nothing came out." Milo went back outside. Eleanor stood in the kitchen with her coffee going cold and her argument dissolving before she could finish constructing it. One night became a second night without anyone making a formal decision about it. That was how it happened. Not a conversation, not Gideon offering or Eleanor accepting. Just Milo with mud on his boots and Pearl at the window, and Henry following Caleb to the barn without being invited. And by the time Eleanor had gathered herself enough to say the words out loud, supper was already being made and it seemed pointless to say them. She told herself tomorrow. Gideon didn't push. That was the thing she kept waiting for, the push. The moment when the accommodation turned into expectation, when the help revealed the hook buried inside it. She had learned about hooks from watching Thaddeus Rusk for 6 weeks, the way he distributed small kindnesses like a man laying out bait. And she had brought that lesson with her to Crowley Ridge Ranch, and she applied it now to everything Gideon did. He didn't push. He didn't ask questions about what had happened in Red Hollow or what they planned to do. He didn't explain how long they could stay or suggest what the arrangement looked like going forward. He got up in the morning, he worked his ranch, he sat at supper and listened more than he spoke, and then he went to bed. If his manner toward the children was warmer than strict practicality required, if he showed Henry how to tie a proper knot on a fence line and didn't rush through it, if he answered Elsie's questions about the cattle breeds with more patience than the questions probably deserved, Eleanor cataloged these things and continued to watch for the hook. She did not find it. What she found instead, on the third day, was Elsie in the kitchen with Caleb, learning how to make biscuit dough, and Elsie was laughing. Eleanor stopped in the doorway. She couldn't remember the last time she had heard Elsie laugh. She could hear, in it, an echo of their mother, the same particular sound, higher, on the left side, and it hit her in the chest in a way she wasn't ready for, and she stepped back into the hallway before Elsie could see her face. She stood with her back against the wall. From the kitchen, Caleb's low voice saying something she couldn't make out. Elsie laughing again. Eleanor pressed her palm flat against the wall and breathed. She thought about Thaddeus's ledger. She thought about the column of names and destinations and amounts. She thought about Elsie's name in that ledger, what destination had been assigned to it, what amount. She thought, Elsie is laughing. She pushed off the wall and went to find something to do with her hands before the feeling in her chest turned into something she couldn't manage. On the fourth day, she went through the ranch books. She did this because she needed to know things not about Gideon personally, but about the practical situation of being at Crowley Ridge Ranch, what resources existed, what the operation looked like, whether the ranch was the kind of place that would still be standing 6 months from now, or the kind that was 2 bad seasons from collapse. She'd learned the basics of reading ledgers from her father, who had maintained careful accounts even when the accounts said uncomfortable things. She found the ledger in the study, and she sat down at the desk, and she read it. An hour later, Gideon appeared in the doorway. He stopped when he saw her. Eleanor looked up. She didn't apologize. You're running thin on summer hay. If you lose 20 head to a dry winter, you'll break even instead of profit. Gideon leaned against the door frame and looked at her. I know, he said. You've been buying from the Kettrick operation. Their prices are better than the mill. Their quality is worse. You're paying less for less. She looked back at the ledger. If you contracted directly with the Alderman farm, they're 16 miles east. They raise good hay, I saw their stacks from the road. You'd pay 10% more and lose less to spoilage. Silence. She looked up again. He was still looking at her with the same expression, not surprised exactly, but recalibrating. How old are you, he said. 13. Where did you learn to read accounts? My father. She closed the ledger carefully. I'm sorry if I shouldn't have touched it. No, Gideon said. He came into the room and took the ledger and set it back on the shelf. You're probably right about the Alderman operation. He paused. I'll write them. Eleanor nodded and stood to leave. Eleanor. She stopped. You're allowed to stay more than one night, he said. I haven't said anything because I figured you'd make that decision when you were ready. But I want you to know you don't have to keep counting the days. She looked at him. I'm not sure I trust you, she said. Not cruel. Just honest. I know, he said. That's fair. You haven't told me what you want from us. Nothing, he said. Same answer as before. Nobody does something like this for nothing. Gideon was quiet for a moment. He looked out the window at the yard where, through the glass, Eleanor could see Henry crouched in the dirt beside the barn, studying something on the ground, with the total absorption of a 5-year-old who has found an insect. My wife and boy died 5 years ago, he said. I told the boy that last night, Milo. What I didn't tell him is that after they died, this house was empty for 5 years. I kept it. I kept everything. I didn't know why, I just did. He turned back from the window. Maybe I kept it because I was waiting for something that needed it. Eleanor looked at him for a long time. That's not an answer, she said. That's a feeling. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. You sound like you're not much interested in feelings. Feelings don't keep people fed. No, he said, they don't. But they keep people from giving up. He moved to the door. Think about staying. That's all I'm asking. He left her in the study. Eleanor stood beside the desk and looked at the window where Henry was now lying flat on his stomach in the dirt, face 2 inches from whatever he'd found, completely unconcerned with the state of his shirt. She thought about it. What she hadn't told Gideon, what she hadn't told anyone, was that she'd seen the tracks. On the morning of the 3rd day, she'd gone out before dawn to walk the perimeter of the property the way she'd been doing every morning since they arrived, covering the same ground, with the same systematic attention she'd been applying to their survival since the night she had listened through Thaddeus's door. She went south along the fence line, and then east, and then doubled back along the creek access. And it was on that northern stretch, where the ground softened in the shade of a live oak, that she found them. 2 horses, walking pace. The prints were a day old, maybe a day and a half, pointing south along the fence line, and then cutting east across the open ground toward Mineral Creek. They had come close. Not close enough to see the house, the terrain folded the right way to prevent that, but close enough that if the riders had angled 5 degrees farther south, they would have had a clear line of sight to the roof. Eleanor had stood over those tracks for 2 minutes, memorizing them, and then walked back to the house and made breakfast, and said nothing. She didn't say anything now either. She thought about saying something to Gideon. Then she thought about what he would do with the information, and she wasn't sure. She knew him well enough to predict that, and she needed to predict it before she decided. What she knew Silas Brand had been at this ranch. Not on it, not yet, but near it. The deception Gideon had performed at the Cottonwoods had bought time, not safety. Silas was thorough. She had learned this in the 6 weeks she'd been watching him move through her uncle's household, executing Thaddeus's business with the specific competence of a man who understood that his employer's comfort depended on his own reliability. He would come back. She was certain of this the way she was certain of weather. The question was when. She told Gideon on the 4th evening. She did it after supper, when the children were upstairs and Caleb was in the bunkhouse, and it was just the 2 of them at the kitchen table, with the lamp between them and the night pressing against the windows. She laid it out plainly, the tracks, the direction, the timeline, her assessment of Silas Brand and what she knew of his methods. Gideon listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "How long have you known?" he said. "Since the 3rd morning." He nodded slowly. She couldn't tell if he was annoyed or just absorbing. "Why didn't you say something sooner?" "I was deciding whether to trust you with it." "And now you have." "Now I have," she said. He leaned back in his chair. He had a way of going still when he was thinking that she had started to recognize, not checked out, not absent, just the kind of stillness that meant everything was happening somewhere she couldn't see. "They'll come here," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes. And when they do, Thaddeus will come with them. He'll have papers. He's your legal guardian." "I know." "Running won't fix that." "I know that too," Eleanor said. "I knew it before we stopped running. We needed time." "Time for what?" She looked at the lamp flame. "To think. To stop being scared long enough to think." Gideon nodded again. "And have you thought?" "I've been thinking since we got here." She looked back at him. "I need to know if you'll stand behind us when they come. Not just sending riders in the wrong direction. I mean, when Thaddeus is standing in your yard with guardianship papers and Silas behind him and whatever sheriff he's brought along. I need to know if you'll be on our side." Gideon looked at her across the table. "Yes," he said. "Why? Because you're children and he's selling you." "That's why." She studied him. "You'd be making an enemy of Thaddeus Rusk. He has money and connections and he doesn't back down from disputes." "Neither do I. He'll accuse you of things, harboring runaways. Maybe worse. Let him." She was quiet for a moment. "You don't know me. You don't know any of us. 5 days ago, you'd never seen us before in your life." "That's true," Gideon said. "So why?" He looked toward the window. "You know what I thought when I saw you step out from those cottonwoods," he said. "I thought, here is a person who is completely out of options and hasn't given up yet. That's not nothing. That's actually something remarkable." He paused. "I've known adults who'd have quit long before you did." Eleanor said nothing. "You have a right to stand somewhere safe," he said. "All of you do. I have a ranch. I have ground." He looked at her. "When they come, I'll be standing beside you." Eleanor folded her hands on the table. She believed him. She wasn't sure she trusted herself to be right about that. But she believed him, and that was going to have to be enough. We should plan, she said. Yes, Gideon agreed. We should. The planning took 3 days. Gideon rode to town on the first day, not to Red Hollow, which was too close and too likely to put him in Thaddeus's orbit, but to Cardwell, the county seat 15 miles south, where there was a courthouse and a land registry and a circuit court that operated on a regular schedule. He was gone from before dawn until after dark, and he came back with a folder of papers and a name. He spread the papers on the kitchen table. Amos Larkin is the county sheriff, he said. He's not in Thaddeus Rusk's pocket. He's thorough and he's fair, and he doesn't take kindly to people who use legal documents for purposes they weren't intended for. Eleanor looked at the papers. One of them was a printed form with blank lines for names and dates. What is this? Guardianship petition, Gideon said. I had the clerk explain the process. I can file an emergency petition seeking guardianship of the 5 of you. It doesn't remove Thaddeus's authority. Automatically, he'd contest it. But it opens a legal proceeding. It means that when he shows up here with his papers, there's a counter-argument already on record. Eleanor looked at him. You'd have to list your name. Yes, and the children's names. Thaddeus will know where we are the moment that's filed. He'll find out we're here anyway, Gideon said. Silas is good at his job. We have maybe a week before he works it out, maybe less. Filing gives us a legal position before he arrives instead of after. Eleanor stared at the petition form. She thought about her name on that paper and Thaddeus seeing it and what it meant to be visible again after 6 days of running to be invisible. All 5 of us, she said. All 5, not just the younger ones. I filed for all 5 Whitlock children, Gideon said. Together. That's what I put on the form. Eleanor looked up at him. She had been braced, somewhere in the back of her mind, for the version of this where someone decided that Eleanor was old enough to fend for herself. She had been braced for it so long that she had built a whole category of plans around it, what she would do if they tried to separate her from the younger ones, how she would fight it. What legal levers a 13-year-old had access to, which was almost none. She hadn't expected all 5. She looked back at the form so Gideon wouldn't see her face. Okay, she said. Her voice came out even. She was grateful for that. When do we file? I ride back to Cardwell tomorrow morning. I'll need to tell the children. I know. She touched the edge of the form with one finger. Thaddeus will come himself this time. He won't send Silas alone. I expect so. He'll be angry. Good, Gideon said. Eleanor looked up. Angry men make mistakes, he said. She nodded slowly. She had observed this. Thaddeus Rusk was not a stupid man, but he was a proud one, and pride had its own particular blindness. What about witnesses? She asked. I've already spoken to 2 neighbors. Ranchers who know Thaddeus's reputation. They're willing to be present when he arrives, which limits what he can claim happened afterward. And Caleb? Gideon's expression shifted. Caleb has been keeping things. What kind of things? Written messages. From Thaddeus to employers. Confirming arrangements for each of you. Caleb ran freight for Thaddeus 3 years ago, before he came to work for me. He kept copies of everything because Thaddeus had a habit of denying he'd said things he'd said. Gideon paused. Caleb never liked him. He kept the letters. Eleanor was very still. How much, she said. What do the letters say? Names. Destinations. Amounts. 3 of the 5 children are specifically mentioned with prices attached. Eleanor's jaw tightened. Pearl's name is in them, Gideon said. And Milo and Elsie. She put both hands flat on the table. She had overheard it. She had known it. But there was a difference between knowing something and seeing it written in a dead man's hand, or, in this case, a living man's hand, which was worse in some ways because it meant he hadn't thought it was wrong enough to hide. I want to see the letters, she said. Eleanor, I want to see them. She looked at him directly. I'm the one who has to stand in front of a judge and explain what happened. I need to know exactly what we have. Gideon looked at her for a moment. Then he went to find Caleb. She read every letter. She read them twice. She read the one about Pearl 3 times, the one that listed her as female, 3 years old, young enough to be shaped, and attached a dollar amount to that assessment, and she read it until the numbers stopped blurring and became simply data, because that was the only way she could be useful with it. When she was done, she stacked them carefully and set them in the folder and closed it. Milo appeared in the doorway. He'd been working with Gideon in the barn all afternoon, and he had hay in his hair and a new scrape on his forearm that he hadn't mentioned. He looked at the folder. "What's that?" "Evidence," Eleanor said. "Of what?" "Of what Thaddeus was planning to do with us." Milo came into the room. He sat down across from her. He looked older than 10 right then. Something in his eyes that had been there since the night they left and grew incrementally each day. A seriousness that his face was too young for and wouldn't be for much longer. "It's in writing," he said. Yes, he put it in writing. He didn't think anyone would see it. Milo stared at the folder. "Does it say what they were going to pay for me?" Eleanor met his eyes. "You don't need to read it. I want to. Milo Eleanor." His voice was flat. "Tell me what it says," she told him. He sat with it for a long time. The kitchen was quiet except for the sound of Elsie and Henry somewhere upstairs, and the distant voice of Caleb talking to the horses through the barn wall. "Okay," Milo said finally. "Okay, I just needed to know." He pushed back from the table. "What do we do about it?" Eleanor looked at her brother. He was 10 years old, and he'd just been told someone had put a price on his labor, like he was a piece of equipment, and he was asking what to do about it. She felt something settle in her chest. "We use it," she said. "When Thaddeus comes, and he'll come, probably within the week, we have these letters, and we have Caleb, and we have Gideon, and we have what I heard him say. We stand our ground, and we make him answer for it. In front of the sheriff? In front of whoever Gideon can get to be there." Milo nodded. He chewed his lower lip, which was a thing he did when he was working through something. "You trust Gideon?" She thought about the conversation at the kitchen table. "About all 5 of them on the petition form. I'm getting there," she said. "I trust him," Milo said simply, with the directness of a 10-year-old who hadn't yet learned to complicate the things he felt. "I know you do. Is that a problem?" Eleanor looked at the folder of letters. "No," she said. "I don't think it is." She found Gideon by the fence that evening, the last light going flat and orange across the grassland. He was fixing a post with a methodical attention that was very like how he did everything, no waste, no rushing, no particular sentiment about it. She stood at the fence line and watched him work. "Why did you stay?" she asked. He didn't look up. "On the ranch? After your wife and son died. Why did you stay here instead of leaving?" He drove the post another inch with the mallet. "I thought about leaving," he said. "First year was hard. I nearly sold it twice." "What stopped you?" He set the mallet down and straightened up and looked out across the grassland the way he sometimes did, like there was something specific he was looking at that she couldn't quite locate. "My son used to run across that field," he said, "out to the big live oak and back. He did it every single day. No reason, just because he could." He paused. "After he died, I used to watch that field and see him running. Not real, I knew it wasn't real, but I could see it." He picked up the mallet again. "Didn't want to go somewhere where I couldn't see that anymore." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry about him," she said. "Both of them." "Thank you." She leaned on the fence post. "Milo said he was the same age as Henry. I noticed that," Gideon said. "First evening, Henry climbed up on that chair and fell asleep with his mouth open, and I thought..." He stopped. He drove the post another inch. "Doesn't matter what I thought." "It does," Eleanor said. "You don't have to say it, but it matters." He looked at her. "You're 13 years old," he said. Not unkindly, with something that was almost wonder in it. 14 in September, she said. "That's still 13. "Yes," she agreed, "it is." He went back to the post. "Thaddeus will come. Probably 4 or 5 days. I have some things to prepare before he does. I'd like your help. With some of it, you know him better than I do. Tell me what you need, his habits, how he handles confrontation, what he does when he's losing an argument." Eleanor thought about Thaddeus Rusk across 6 weeks of dinner tables and parlor conversations and overheard negotiations. She thought about the way his face went very still, his voice went very quiet when he was angry, and the way he always transferred blame to someone else before he accepted any consequence. "He'll try to make it your fault," she said. "Whatever happens. He'll say you took us, that you encouraged us to run, that you're harboring runaways for your own reasons. Let him say it. He'll try to make you angry, get you to raise your voice so he looks like the reasonable one." "I don't raise my voice." Eleanor looked at him. She believed that. He'll try to separate us, she said. During the conversation, I mean. He'll try to get some of the children away from you before anything legal happens. He knows Pearl, especially. She's small and she won't understand what's happening. And if he can get her away from me before there's a witness. Nobody leaves that yard without my say, Gideon said. The post was set. He tested it with both hands, solid. I promise you that. Eleanor looked at the grassland going dark. Silas Brand's tracks were out there somewhere. 2 horses, a day and a half old, angled east toward Mineral Creek. He'll come at dawn, she said. Thaddeus prefers dawn. He thinks people are weaker at dawn, less ready. All right, Gideon said. He picked up his tools. Then we'll be ready before dawn. He walked back toward the barn. Eleanor stayed at the fence a moment longer, looking north toward the ridge where the riders had appeared the first day. The sky was going dark and purple, and the stars were starting to come out, and the grassland was very still. She thought. One night, she looked at the house with the lights in the windows, and the sound of Henry's voice carrying faintly across the yard in the particular register of a 5-year-old who had found something interesting. She thought 5 empty rooms. She turned and walked back to the house. Behind her, the grassland settled into dark. Somewhere north along the ridge, probably, 2 riders were making camp, reporting what they'd seen, reporting direction and distance and landmarks. In 4 days, maybe 5, Thaddeus Rusk would ride down out of that ridge with papers and money and the absolute conviction that the law was on his side. He wasn't wrong about the law. He was wrong about something else. He was wrong about what Gideon Crowley would do when he got there. And he was very, very wrong about Eleanor Whitlock. She had stopped running. She had found her ground. And she had learned something in 6 days of exhaustion and fear and 1 kitchen table conversation by lamplight that she hadn't known before, something her father had never had occasion to teach her because they'd never needed it. Sometimes the most dangerous thing a person can do is simply refuse to move. She went inside. The door closed behind her. She was right about the dawn. 4 days later, not 5. Thaddeus Rusk didn't give them the 5th day. Eleanor had been up since 3 in the morning, not because she'd planned it that way, not because some alarm had sounded, but because she had not slept more than 2 hours at a stretch since the planning began, and her body had started treating sleep as a luxury she hadn't earned. She was in the kitchen with the lamp turned low, going through the letters again, memorizing specific phrases the way she'd memorized the creeks and landmarks on their walk out of Red Hollow, because she wanted every word available to her without having to look down at the page. She heard the horses at first light, not close, still a 1/4 mile out, maybe more, coming down off the north ridge along the same line Silas's riders had used the first time. The sound carried differently in the cold, morning air, sharper, and Eleanor counted the rhythm without thinking about it, the way a person counts without knowing they're counting. Not 3 horses this time. 7. She stood up from the table before she'd consciously decided to stand. She went to the window. The sky was the particular gray-blue of just before sunrise, enough light to see the ridgeline and the silhouettes coming down it in a loose formation. 7 riders moving with the deliberate pace of men who knew where they were going and weren't in a hurry because they didn't think they needed to be. She could see Thaddeus at the front from the shape of him. Thicker than Silas, a different posture in the saddle, the posture of a man who owns things. Eleanor turned from the window. She went upstairs. She went to Gideon's door first and knocked twice, sharp. His voice came back immediately, which meant he hadn't been sleeping either. Then she went to Milo's room and pushed the door open and said his name once, and Milo was sitting up before she finished saying it. "They're coming," she said. 7 riders. Thaddeus is with them. Milo got out of bed. "Wake the others," Eleanor said. "Get them dressed. Bring them downstairs. Don't tell Henry and Pearl what's happening, just get them moving. Tell Elsie the truth, she can handle it." Milo was already pulling his boots on. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going outside." He looked up. "Eleanor, I'm not running," she said. "I'm going to stand on the porch." She left him and went back downstairs. Gideon was in the kitchen already, dressed, pouring water into a basin, with the methodical calm of a man who had decided the night before exactly how he was going to behave this morning, and was not going to deviate from it. He looked at Eleanor when she came in. "How far out?" Quarter mile, moving slow, 7 horses, he nodded once. I need you to do something before they reach the yard. What? Go to the south gate. Open it. Eleanor stared at him. Open the gate? Yes. Gideon, there are 7 of them. Open the gate, he said again. Trust me. She looked at his face. He was not a man who used those 2 words carelessly. She had established that much about him in the past several days. She went to the south gate. She swung it open, and she saw what was on the other side of it. Sheriff Amos Larkin sat his horse just beyond the gate with the particular stillness of a man who has been waiting long enough to get comfortable with waiting. He was a broad man, somewhere past 50, with a deputy's star on his coat and a circuit court clerk beside him, who was holding a satchel of papers against his chest with both arms. Behind Larkin were 2 other men on horseback ranchers. From the look of them, neighbors Gideon had spoken of, and behind them, on a gray mule, was Caleb Finch, with a leather document case roped to his saddle. Eleanor stood at the open gate and looked at all of them. She looked back at the house. Gideon had come onto the porch. He had anticipated Thaddeus's return, and he had prepared something more powerful than a confrontation. He had prepared witnesses. Sheriff Larkin touched his hat brim at Eleanor. Morning, miss. You'd be Eleanor Whitlock. Yes, sir, she said. Mr. Crowley says you've got some things that need settling today. Yes, sir, she said again. All right, then. Larkin swung down from his horse with the grunt of a man for whom dismounting had gotten less graceful over the years. Let's go settle them. Thaddeus Rusk came through the north gate 6 minutes later. Eleanor was standing on the porch beside Gideon when he rode in, and she had the particular sensation of watching something she had been dreading for weeks arrive, and finding that the dread had not adequately prepared her for the reality of it. Thaddeus was larger in person than he was in her memory, or maybe it was just that she had spent 6 days shrinking from him, and was only now standing still enough to see him clearly. He was a big man, red-faced from the ride, with the kind of groomed prosperity that didn't disguise its origins money made through work that other people did while he watched and charged for the use of the yard. He wore a good coat and a hat that cost more than most men in this county spent on a month of supplies, and he rode a well-fed horse, and the 6 men behind him were arranged in the particular pattern of an entourage rather than a work crew. Silas Brand was second from the left. He was looking at Eleanor with an expression she couldn't read at first, and then could. He was calculating. Not angry, not triumphant, just calculating the way he always did. Thaddeus pulled his horse up in the middle of the yard. He looked at Gideon on the porch. He looked at Eleanor beside Gideon. He looked at the sheriff, standing to the left with his deputy, and whatever expression he'd ridden in wearing changed by a degree that Eleanor noted carefully. He hadn't expected Larkin. He recovered fast. She gave him that. Sheriff, he said, making it sound cordial, like a man who had nothing to be concerned about. Didn't know you'd be here, Mr. Rusk, Larkin said. Mr. Crowley notified my office that there might be a dispute over guardianship of 5 minor children. I make it a habit to be present when those kinds of disputes happen. Prevents misunderstandings. Thaddeus smiled. The smile did not reach anywhere near his eyes. No dispute, he said. These are my sister's children. I'm their legal guardian. I'm here to take them home. That may be, Larkin said. We'll work through it properly. Thaddeus swung down from his horse and handed the reins to one of his men and walked toward the porch. He kept his eyes on Gideon, and his voice in the register of reasonable grievance, not angry, not threatening, just a man who has been put to considerable inconvenience by someone else's poor judgment. Crowley, he said, I don't know what these children told you, but I can assure you they're confused and frightened, and they need to come home. They seem clear-headed to me, Gideon said. They're children. Children run. They get scared, and they make decisions that don't make sense, and it's the responsibility of the adults around them, too. Mr. Rusk. Gideon's voice hadn't changed. I filed an emergency guardianship petition with the county court in Cardwell 3 days ago. The sheriff has a copy. Before we talk about who's taking anyone where, I'd like to address that first. Thaddeus stopped. It was very brief, the stopping. Less than a second. But Eleanor had been watching his face, and she caught at the specific moment when the situation revealed itself to be different from what he'd prepared for. Guardianship, Thaddeus said. He said it the way a person says a word they want to examine from all sides before committing to a response. On what grounds? On the grounds that you were arranging to sell the children separately to different employers in exchange for money. That is a serious and completely false accusation. I have letters, Caleb said. He had come up behind Eleanor without her noticing, which was typical of Caleb. He was standing at the porch rail with the leather document case open and a stack of folded papers in his hand, and he was looking at Thaddeus Rusk with an expression Eleanor had not seen on his face before. Not anger exactly, something older and quieter than anger. Thaddeus looked at Caleb. Something moved across his face. Too fast to be sure of, but Eleanor thought she saw it a flicker of recalculation, like a man revising a plan midway through executing it. Caleb Finch, he said evenly. Mr. Rusk, Caleb said. I worked your freight yard 3 years. I kept copies of everything you put in writing. Old habit. He held up the stack of papers. I've got 7 letters here. 3 of them name specific children with prices next to their names. Thaddeus turned to the sheriff. This man worked for me briefly and was dismissed for poor performance. Whatever he claims to have is, I'll look at them, Larkin said. He walked to Caleb and took the papers and stood there in the yard and read them, one by one with the unhurried thoroughness of a man who takes his job seriously enough not to rush the parts that matter. Nobody spoke while he read. Eleanor stood on the porch and watched Thaddeus Rusk's face during the silence, and what she saw was a man performing patience, performing certainty, performing the expression of someone who has nothing to worry about. She had seen this performance before at her mother's funeral. At the dinner table on the evenings he discussed business with Silas, in voices he thought were too low for a 13-year-old to hear. It was a good performance. It was not good enough. Thaddeus made his move while Larkin was still reading. He had been edging toward the porch during the silence, not rushing, not making it obvious, just drifting in the way a man drifts when he wants to seem like he's simply standing rather than positioning. Eleanor had been watching his feet, and she saw it 2 steps before it became a problem. He was heading for the door, not for Eleanor, not for Gideon, for the door for the children inside. She moved without thinking. She stepped to the right and put herself directly between Thaddeus and the door, and she put her back against the wood and looked at him and said nothing. Thaddeus stopped. He looked at her. His expression shifted into something she recognized, the particular patience of an adult who intends to simply wait out a child because children move eventually. Eleanor, he said. His voice was gentle. That was the thing about Thaddeus. He was almost always gentle right before he stopped being gentle, and the gentleness was worse somehow, more calculated than anger would have been. You've made a difficult situation worse by running. I understand you were scared. You're 13 years old, and you lost your parents, and you made a bad decision. No one is going to punish you for that. Don't, Eleanor said. Don't what? Don't use that voice. I know what that voice means. Thaddeus looked at her for a moment. He smiled slightly, which was worse than the voice. What does it mean? It means you've decided on something, and you're waiting for me to stop being in the way. Eleanor, I heard you, she said, 6 weeks ago. In your study, you and Silas. You were reading from the ledger. She did not look away from his face. You said separate them before the end of the month. Easier that way. Children who stay together make trouble. A beat of silence. I don't know what you think you heard. Pearl, $7. The Connolly woman. Eleanor kept her voice flat, just reciting, not letting anything into it that he could use. Elsie, the laundry house in Mineral Creek. Milo, the Halverson farm. Strong enough to work, you said. And me, you'd find someone who needed a household manager before winter. She watched his face. She watched what happened to the gentleness. You're a child, he said, with a child's imperfect understanding of adult conversations. I can read your letters, Caleb said from behind her. Thaddeus turned. Out loud, Caleb said, if you'd like. Larkin was finished reading. He folded the papers carefully and tucked them inside his coat and turned to face Thaddeus Rusk with the expression of a man who has made up his mind but has not yet decided to say so. Mr. Rusk, he said, I'd like to hear your explanation for these letters. I'd like to hear how letters written by my former employee came to be in his possessions. After you explain them. Thaddeus pulled himself straight. There was a shift in him, the performance of patience dropping away, something harder underneath. These children are my legal responsibility. Whatever accusations are being manufactured here, the fact remains. The letter dated April 14th names Pearl Whitlock, age 3, and assigns her a value of $7 to be paid to you personally upon delivery to a Mrs. Harriet Connolly of Mineral Creek. Larkin spoke without heat, without drama, in the tone of a man reading from a document he has already absorbed. The letter dated April 22nd names Milo Whitlock, age 10, and refers to his being placed at the Halverson farm in exchange for what is described as a fair arrangement. The third letter, those letters are taken out of context. What is the context, Larkin said, in which placing a 3-year-old child with a stranger in exchange for $7 has a reasonable explanation? Thaddeus opened his mouth. He closed it. Eleanor watched this happen. She had wondered, during all the planning, during all the letters, and the late evenings at the kitchen table, what Thaddeus would do at this specific moment, the moment when the argument he'd prepared ran into facts it couldn't dissolve. She had imagined anger. She had imagined indignation. She had imagined him coming at the situation from a different angle, finding a new way in. She had not imagined what actually happened. He turned to Silas. He didn't say anything, just turned, with the particular look of a man who has decided that the appropriate response to a problem is to reassign it. Eleanor watched Silas Brand receive that look. She watched him understand what it meant. He was meant to step forward. He was meant to say something, take the weight, explain it away, put himself between Thaddeus and the consequence. That was what Silas did. That was what Silas had always done. What Silas actually did was nothing. He sat on his horse and looked at Thaddeus and said nothing, and Eleanor saw in his face the specific moment when a man decides that the loyalty he's been selling has cost more than it's worth. Silas, Thaddeus said, a warning in it now. Lo. Silas looked at him for another moment. Then he looked at Sheriff Larkin. The letters are accurate, Silas said. I delivered them myself. The yard went very quiet. Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, not relief, not yet. Something that was the precursor to relief, the first signal that the ground she'd been standing on was actually holding. Thaddeus turned on Silas with a speed that was surprising for a big man. He was going to put it on me, Silas said to Larkin. Not loud, not heated, just stating it. I could see it coming the minute those papers came out. I've been covering for this man for 6 years. He paused. I'm not covering for this. You signed those letters, Thaddeus said. His voice had gone to something different now. Now, the performance was over, the gentleness was over, and what was underneath was not rage, but something colder than rage. The particular temperature of a man who has just had his cover story dismantled by the one person who's supposed to provide it. You're as responsible for every arrangement as I am. I know it, Silas said. I know it exactly. He dismounted. He walked to Larkin and held out his hand, and Larkin shook it, briefly, and Silas said, I'll tell you everything I know. The next hour was not clean or simple or dramatic in any satisfying way. It was paperwork and voices and Larkin's deputy writing things down in a small notebook, and Caleb reading sections of the letters aloud when Larkin asked him to, and Thaddeus making 3 separate attempts to reframe what was happening in each, one falling apart before it was fully constructed. Eleanor stood on the porch for the first part of it, and then sat on the step when her legs started to feel unreliable, which she herself because no one was watching her in particular anymore. The children came outside at some point. She didn't remember deciding to let them, they simply appeared. Henry came first, drawn by the horses and the general sense of something happening that he didn't understand and wasn't going to stay inside to miss. Pearl appeared, holding the rag doll with both hands, pressed against Milo's side, watching the adults in the yard with large, cautious eyes. Elsie came and sat beside Eleanor on the step. She didn't ask questions. She just sat. After a while, she put her head on Eleanor's shoulder, and Eleanor put her arm around her, and they sat like that and listened to the proceedings play out in the yard below them. One of Thaddeus's riders left early, just turned his horse and rode out the north gate without a word. Then another. By the time the formal business was concluded, 4 of the 6 men Thaddeus had ridden in with were gone, which said something about the nature of employment-based loyalty that Eleanor filed away for later consideration. Thaddeus himself said very little after Silas began talking. He stood at the edge of the yard with his hat in his hands, and the good coat and the expensive hat sitting on a man who had, in the space of 40 minutes, been reduced from a grievance to a problem. His face had gone to something flat and inward, and Eleanor looked at it and felt not satisfaction, not triumph. Something more complicated than either of those. She thought about her mother's face at the funeral. How Thaddeus had stood at the grave and said family was family. She thought about Pearl's name in the ledger, $7. She sat on the step with Elsie's head on her shoulder, and she felt the complicated thing in her chest, and she didn't try to name it. Larkin came to the porch when he was done with Silas. He stopped at the bottom of the step and looked up at Eleanor with the directness of a man who requires us not to soften things unnecessarily. "I'm placing your uncle under arrest," he said. "The charges will include fraud, unlawful labor arrangements with minors, and falsifying portions of the guardianship claim. The court in Cardwell will sort out the rest." Eleanor nodded. "The petition Mr. Crowley filed will go before the circuit judge inside the next 2 weeks. Given what we've heard today, I'll be recommending the court give it full consideration." He paused. "It would help if you were willing to make a statement about what you heard in your uncle's study." "I'll make a statement," she said. "You understand what that means? Talking in front of the judge." "Formally, yes, sir." He looked at her for a moment. "You've managed something here that most adults couldn't have," he said. Eleanor looked out at the yard. Gideon was talking to the 2 rancher witnesses near the gate, and Caleb was putting his letters back in the document case with the same deliberate care he put into everything, and Milo was standing a few feet away from Silas with his arms crossed, watching the former foreman with an expression that was neither forgiving nor hateful, but something more considered than either. "We had help," Eleanor said. Larkin nodded. "You did," he agreed. "Good help." He turned and went back into the yard. They arrested Thaddeus near the north gate. Eleanor watched it happen from the porch step. Larkin's deputy produced irons and Thaddeus submitted to them with the stiff silence of a man saving his remaining dignity for the witnesses still present, and Eleanor watched his face as the deputy walked him to the gate, and she found, to her own surprise, that she had nothing to say to him. She had prepared things in the abstract over the past several days. Things she might say if this moment came. Accusations she could make, truths she could deliver, the specific satisfaction of saying out loud to his face what she had spent 6 weeks knowing and 6 days running from. She said none of them. She watched him go through the gate, and she thought about what Milo had said. He put it in writing, like they weren't even people, and she thought about Pearl asleep on Caleb's knee the first evening. And she thought about the 5 rooms upstairs with quilts on the beds. She thought, it's enough that he's going. Thaddeus Rusk went through the gate without looking back at her, and Eleanor let him go. The yard cleared slowly, the way yards do after something significant has happened gradually, without announcement, the various people finding reasons to be elsewhere, until it was just Crowley Ridge Ranch again. Just the fence and the barn and the house, with the clean windows and the morning light going warm on the grass. Milo came and stood beside Eleanor at the porch rail. He was quiet for a moment. "Then, is it over?" "The first part," she said. "What's the second part?" "The judge. The petition." "A few weeks, probably." Milo chewed his lip. "But he's not taking us back." "No." She looked at him. "He's not taking us back." Henry appeared at the screen door behind them and pressed his face against it in the way he did, nose flat, looking out at the yard with the expression of a child who has missed most of the important events and is not sure how to feel about that. "Did something happen?" Henry asked. "Yes," Milo said. "What?" The bad man left. Henry considered this. "Is he coming back?" "No," Eleanor said. Henry processed this for a moment. Then he pushed the screen door open and went down the porch steps and across the yard to the barn, where Caleb was putting away the document case, and said something that Eleanor couldn't hear that made Caleb stop and look at him, and then unexpectedly laugh. Eleanor watched this. She watched Caleb's face when he laughed, which was not a thing she had seen before, how it changed everything about his expression, put years back in it. She watched Henry take Caleb's hand. She looked away before the feeling in her chest turned into something she couldn't manage in public. Gideon came to the porch when everyone else was gone. He stood at the rail and didn't say anything immediately, which was typical of him. He had a way of letting silence be what it was without trying to fill it, which was a thing Eleanor had come to understand as one of his particular qualities rather than a deficiency. She waited. You stood your ground, he said finally. We stood our ground, she said. He looked at her. Something in his face that she'd been seeing more of lately. Not quite a smile, not quite something else, but the expression of a man who has been surprised by something and isn't sure whether to be glad about it or just awed. You did something, there at the beginning, he said. When he was moving toward the door, you stepped in front of it. Yes. Before I could, you were watching Larkin. Still, he paused. I've been dealing with difficult men for 20 years. I've never seen anyone cut off a move like that without raising their voice. Eleanor looked out at the empty yard. He was going to get to the children, she said. If he got to them before Larkin was done readings. I know what he would have done. Then you know why I moved. Gideon was quiet. Then he said, I need to ask you something. She looked at him. The petition, he said. The guardianship. It's filed, and the judge will rule on it. But before he does, before any of that becomes formal, I want to ask you directly. Because you're the oldest, and because you have a right to be asked. Eleanor waited. Do you want this, he said. Not do you need it. Not is it the best option do you want it. This ranch, this arrangement, whatever it becomes. She looked at the barn where Henry and Caleb were still standing in the doorway. She looked at the house where Elsie had gone inside, probably to the kitchen, because Elsie gravitated toward kitchens the way some people gravitated toward warmth. She looked at Milo, who had gone to the fence line and was looking north at the empty ridge with his hands in his pockets and his shoulders carrying whatever 10-year-olds carry when they've seen too much. She thought about her mother's house and how it had smelled and the specific sound her father made when he laughed. She thought about the grave in Red Hollow and the 6 days of walking and Pearl's weight on her hip. She thought about 5 empty rooms. Yes, she said. Gideon nodded. He didn't add anything to it. He didn't expand or qualify or explain what came next in terms of practical arrangements or legal timelines or any of the things that would need to be sorted out over the coming weeks. He just nodded. And that was enough for now. Enough for this morning, this yard, this particular piece of ground that Eleanor had stopped running on and decided was worth staying for. She looked north one more time at the empty ridge where 7 riders had come down at dawn. No dust, no movement, just the sky going blue and the grass going gold and the ordinary quiet of a morning that had improbably turned out different from how it was supposed to go. She turned and went inside. Somewhere in the kitchen she could hear Elsie asking Caleb whether he thought biscuits would be ready before noon, and Caleb's voice saying probably not, and Elsie saying, well, then we'd better start, and the sound of the stove being opened and closed. Eleanor went to the kitchen. She rolled up her sleeves. She put her hands in the flour. The biscuits burned on the bottom. Not badly, not inedible, but enough that Caleb scraped the worst of the black off 3 of them before he put them on the table and said nothing about it, which was his particular form of tact. Elsie noticed and said nothing either, which was remarkable for a 7-year-old, and Eleanor noticed Elsie noticing and said nothing about any of it, and that was how the first meal after Thaddeus Rusk rode out of their lives. In irons got eaten at Crowley Ridge Ranch, slightly burned biscuits and good bean soup, and nobody making it into more than it was. Henry asked for seconds. Pearl fell asleep in her chair before she finished her bowl. That afternoon, Eleanor sat at the kitchen table with paper and a pencil and wrote down everything she could remember about what she'd heard in Thaddeus's study. Dates, phrases, exact words where she could recall them, approximate words where she couldn't, and a clear notation distinguishing between the two. She'd learned this from her father also, that the difference between what you know and what you think you know is exactly the distance between being believed and not being believed, and that distance matters most when the stakes are highest. She filled 2 pages. Then she went back and read it and crossed out 3 things she wasn't certain of, and rewrote 2 others more carefully, and when she was done, she had something that was not perfect but was honest, which she had decided was more valuable than perfect. Gideon found her there an hour later. He read it without sitting down, standing at the table with his hat still on, and when he finished, he set it back on the table. The judge is going to ask you how old you were when you heard this, he said. 13, same as now. He'll ask whether you understood what you were hearing. I'll tell him I understood well enough to take 4 children and walk 6 days into open country to keep them from being separated, Eleanor said. If that's not understanding, I don't know what is. Gideon looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up the statement again and folded it carefully and put it in his coat pocket. I'll have the clerk look at it tomorrow. We ride to Cardwell in 2 days. All of us? You and Milo. The younger ones stay here with Caleb. Eleanor nodded. Then, what happens if the judge decides the petition isn't sufficient? It's sufficient. But if he decides, Eleanor. Gideon pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, which was something he did when he wanted to be direct rather than reassuring, and she had come to distinguish between the two. I hired a man in Cardwell 3 days ago, a lawyer named Pemberton. He's reviewed the petition and the letters and your statement. He says the case is strong. Lawyers say cases are strong when they want you to feel better. Pemberton doesn't, Gideon said. He told me the case has 2 weak points and what they were and what we'd need to address them. That's not a man managing my feelings. That's a man doing his job. Eleanor was quiet. What are the weak points? She said. Your age. The court may feel a 13-year-old's account of an overheard conversation is unreliable. And the second? That I'm a single man with no family history of child-rearing, applying to take 5 children I met 8 days ago. She looked at the table. Those are real problems. They are, Gideon said. Caleb is addressing the first one. He was present on 2 occasions when Thaddeus discussed the arrangements with employers directly, in front of witnesses, whose names Caleb can provide. Your statement corroborates his. 2 sources are better than 1. He paused. The second one is harder. What does Pemberton say? He says the letters and Silas's statement are strong enough that the judge may overlook it. He says character references from the neighbors who were present this morning will help. He says Gideon stopped. He looked at the table for a moment. He says it would help considerably if you were willing to speak to the judge directly. Not just a written statement. In person. Eleanor looked up. Not about what you heard, Gideon said. About the ranch. About these weeks. About whether this is a place you want to be. She understood what he was asking. He was asking her to stand in front of a judge and say, in her own voice, that Gideon Crowley was a man who should be trusted with 5 children. That the ranch was a home and not just a shelter. That the petition was not a transaction but something else. Something that didn't have a clean legal name, but that a judge who was paying attention might recognize anyway. He was asking her to advocate for him the way he had advocated for them. All right, she said. You don't have to, I know. She met his eyes. I said, all right. The 2 days before Cardwell were not quiet. That was the thing Eleanor hadn't anticipated, that once the immediate crisis passed, the shape of ordinary life would move in to fill the space. And ordinary life at Crowley Ridge Ranch turned out to be considerably louder and more complicated than the crisis had been in some ways. Henry broke a fence slat on the second morning by trying to climb it to see whether he could see the road from the top, which he couldn't. And the slat split under him and deposited him in the dirt, with a scrape on his chin that bled more than the wound warranted. He came into the kitchen with his chin dripping, and an expression that was trying hard to be stoic and not entirely succeeding. And Caleb cleaned it and put a cloth on it, and told him the story of the time he himself had fallen off a fence when he was 6 and broken 2 fingers, and Henry listened to this story with complete absorption and forgot entirely about being stoic. Milo had a harder time. Eleanor noticed it on the first day and said nothing, watching. He wasn't misbehaving, wasn't withdrawn in any obvious way. He just had a particular restlessness, fixing things, carrying things, finding tasks, and completing them before anyone asked. Moving from one end of the ranch to the other, with the constant low-level industry of a person trying to outpace something they can't name. She found him at the water trough on the evening, before they left for Cardwell, sitting on the edge of it with his boots off and his feet in the water, despite the fact that the water was cold, and he was going to have damp socks in the morning. She sat beside him. Neither of them said anything for a while. You're scared, she said eventually. Not a question. I'm not scared, Milo said, in exactly the tone of voice that meant he was scared. What are you, his lip? His feet moved in the water. What if the judge says no, he won't, but what if? Eleanor looked at the barn. The light was going low and orange, and Caleb was moving around inside doing the evening tasks with particular unhurried competence of a man who has done the same things so many times that his hands do them without instruction. Then we figure out the next thing, she said. What's the next thing? I don't know yet, but there's always a next thing. We walked 6 days with almost no food and we didn't run out of next things. Milo was quiet. Then it's not the same. I know it's not. Running, I knew what we were running from. He stopped. I don't know what to call this. It's like waiting to find out if something real is actually real. Eleanor thought about that. It was more articulate than she'd expected from him, which surprised her and then didn't, because Milo surprised her regularly, and she should have stopped being surprised. It's real, she said. Whatever the judge says, what happened here is real. Pearl slept. Henry's learning to tie fence knots. Elsie laughed last week for the first time since she stopped. It's real. Milo looked at her. Are you scared? Yes, she said. He blinked. He'd expected the same answer she'd given him, before reassurance dressed up as certainty. She could see him adjusting to what she'd actually said. Of what? Of wanting something this much, she said. It's easier when you don't want things. When you're just surviving, you don't have anything to lose. Now I have something to lose. She looked at the house. That's harder. Milo sat with that for a moment. Gideon's not going to let them say no, Milo said finally. Not naively, not the way children say things they want to be true, but with a specific conviction that had evidence behind it. No, Eleanor agreed. He's not. Then we'll be okay. She put her arm around his shoulders. He was 10 years old, and he had mud on his feet and damp socks waiting for him in the morning. And he had just said something that was both completely simple and completely true. Get your feet out of the water, she said. You'll be miserable tomorrow. He got his feet out of the water. They rode to Cardwell before dawn. Eleanor and Gideon and Milo. With Milo on the spare horse, Gideon kept for ranch work, a steady bay named Comet, who had no particular interest in living up to the name. They rode without much conversation, the dark country opening up ahead of them, and the stars still visible at the edges of the sky. And Eleanor sat her horse and watched the ground go by and went through her statement in her head for the 4th time. Not the words, but the architecture of it, which thing she said first and why, what she led with, and what she held back for the moment when it would carry most weight. She had learned this from watching Thaddeus. The irony of it was not lost on her. Cardwell was bigger than Red Hollow, but only by degree a proper courthouse on the square, a hotel, 3 competing dry goods operations, and the particular energy of a county seat that knows it's the most important town in a radius of 40 miles and doesn't let anyone forget it. They arrived at 7 and went directly to Pemberton's office above the hardware store, where a small man with careful eyes and ink on his collar shook Eleanor's hand as if she were an adult and asked her to sit down and went through the statement, line by line, for 40 minutes. He changed 2 words in one sentence. He added a clarifying phrase to another. He did not change the substance of anything. You're clear? He said when they were done. Yes, Eleanor said. The judge may be skeptical of your account. Not hostile, Judge Waverley is a fair man, but skeptical. If he pushes back, don't defend yourself. Just tell him again what you heard, exactly as you heard it. Don't elaborate. Don't explain. Don't try to persuade him. Just say what happened. Just say what happened, Pemberton agreed. He looked at Gideon. Caleb Finch is coming? He'll be here at 9. Good. His testimony is the backbone of this. Eleanor's statement corroborates it. He tapped the folder. The letters are what they are. They speak for themselves. Silas Brand has already given a signed statement to the sheriff's office. We're in a strong position. Gideon nodded. Milo had been sitting in the corner chair this entire time, listening with complete attention and saying nothing. He was better at that than Eleanor had given him credit for. He sat still and absorbed everything and kept his face neutral, which was not a natural state for a 10-year-old and meant he was working at it. When Pemberton finished, Milo looked at Eleanor. She gave him the smallest nod she could manage. He nodded back. The courtroom was on the 2nd floor of the courthouse, a plain room with wooden benches and tall windows that let in more light than warmth. Judge Waverley sat at the front, a thin man of 60 or so, with the sharp, deliberate face of someone who has spent decades separating what people say from what they mean, and has stopped being surprised by the distance between the two. Thaddeus Rusk was not present. He was in the county jail 2 blocks away, where Eleanor understood he would remain pending his criminal charges. His absence was both a relief and a small disappointment. She had half prepared herself, To see him across a room under these circumstances, and the preparation had cost her something, and now she had nothing to spend it on. Pemberton presented the petition first. He was methodical and spared no dramatics, no appeals to sentiment, just the facts arranged in the order that made them most legible. The guardianship petition, the children's circumstances following the death of their parents, the evidence of Thaddeus Rusk's intent, Caleb's letters, Silas Brand's signed statement. Judge Waverly read everything himself before he let anyone speak. He read slowly. Eleanor watched his face while he read and learned nothing from it, which she supposed was the point. When he was done, he set the papers down and looked at Caleb first. "Mr. Finch," he said, "you kept these letters for 3 years." "Yes, Your Honor." "Why?" Caleb looked at the judge without particular nervousness, which Eleanor respected. "Thaddeus Rusk denied things he'd said in writing on 3 separate occasions when I worked for him. I learned to keep copies. Did you know at the time that the letters concerned children?" "Not at the time I kept them. No, I learned that when Mr. Crowley told me what had happened. And you came forward voluntarily?" "Yes, Your Honor." The judge looked at him for a moment longer. Then he looked at Eleanor. "Miss Whitlock," he said, "you're 13. "Yes, Your Honor. And you've submitted a written statement regarding a conversation you overheard in your uncle's household." "Yes, Your Honor." "How old were you when you heard this conversation?" 13. "It was approximately 8 weeks ago." "Walk me through it," he said. "In your own words. Not the statement. Just tell me what you heard." Eleanor put the statement out of her head. She told him what she'd heard the way she would have told Milo plainly, in order, without decoration. Thaddeus at the ledger. Silas with the notebook, the names and the destinations and the amounts. The specific phrase she'd held in her head, since the moment she heard it, separate them, before the end of the month, easier that way. Children who stay together make trouble. She said it without stopping. She said it without her voice doing anything she didn't want it to do, which cost her, more than she would have admitted. When she finished, the judge was quiet for a moment. "Pearl is 3 years old," he said. "Yes, Your Honor." "And you understood, when you heard this, that your uncle intended to place her with a woman in Mineral Creek in exchange for money?" "Yes, Your Honor. And that motivated you to take your siblings and leave?" "Yes, Your Honor." He looked at her steadily. "You walked 6 days?" "Yes, with a 3-year-old. "Yes." He made a small sound that was not quite a word and looked back at the papers. Then he looked at Gideon. "Mr. Crowley," he said, "you're a widower." "Yes, Your Honor. You've operated Crowley Ridge Ranch alone for 5 years. "With my ranch hand, Caleb Finch." "Yes. You have no experience with children." "I had a son," Gideon said. "He died at 4 or 5 years ago. Along with my wife." A beat of silence. The judge's expression didn't change, but something in the room did. "I'm sorry," Waverly said, and meant it. "Thank you," Gideon said. "Mr. Crowley, this petition asks me to grant permanent guardianship of 5 children to a man who, by his own account, has no recent experience raising children, is unmarried, and met these children less than 2 weeks ago." The judge's tone was not hostile, but it was not gentle either. "Help me understand why I should do that." "Because they need somewhere to be," Gideon said. "Together. And I have somewhere. That's a thin argument. The alternative is returning them to a guardian who is pricing them out like livestock," Gideon said. "The criminal charges will proceed against Thaddeus Rusk, regardless of what you decide today. But if you decline this petition, those children have no legal placement while that process plays out. Which means the court decides where they go in the meantime. Which means they might be separated anyway, while the case against the man who was trying to separate them works its way through the system." He paused. "With respect, Your Honor, I don't think you want that outcome, and I don't believe the court wants it either." Waverly looked at him for a long moment. "That's a better argument," he said. He looked at Milo. "Son," he said. Milo sat up straight. "Yes, Your Honor. Do you want to be at Crowley Ridge Ranch?" Milo didn't hesitate. "Yes, Your Honor." "Why?" "Because my sister stopped running there," Milo said. "And when she stops running somewhere, it means it's worth staying." The judge looked at Milo for a moment. Then he looked at Eleanor. Something passed across his face, not sentiment, not sympathy exactly, but the expression of a man who has heard enough to know what he's going to do, and is simply finishing the process of arriving there. "I'm going to take a recess," he said. 30 minutes. Eleanor sat on the courthouse steps with Milo during the recess. The morning had gotten warm. Cardwell's Square was doing its ordinary business around them. Wagons, foot traffic, the sound of hammering from somewhere down the block. Gideon stood at the bottom of the steps, talking to Pemberton in low voices, and Eleanor watched them without trying to hear what they were saying. "Did we do all right?" Milo asked. "We did fine. You think he'll say yes?" "I think he's going to say yes," Eleanor said. Not because she was certain she wasn't certain, not entirely, but because the direction of the morning had been pointing there, and she had learned to read direction. Pemberton looks pleased, and Pemberton doesn't look pleased when things aren't going well. Milo looked at the square. A dog was sleeping in the shade of the hardware store across the way, with the total commitment of a dog that has found exactly the right spot. Milo watched it for a while. "When we get back," he said, "Gideon said I could help with the south pasture fence. The whole line needs resetting before fall." Eleanor looked at him. "You're planning the fall," she said. "Somebody should," Milo said. She wanted to say something to that. She had several things available, something about how he'd grown, something about how their parents would have recognized him in this moment, something that acknowledged what the last several weeks had cost him and what he'd carried and how she'd watched him carry it. She said none of it. "Don't volunteer for more fence line than you can finish," she said instead. "Gideon won't push you, but he'll notice if you overpromise." Milo nodded seriously. "I know. And you need to stop letting Henry follow you into the barn when the horses are moving around. He's too small to be in there when Eleanor—" "What?" "We're going to be okay." He looked at her directly. "I know you're still planning for the thing that goes wrong. I can tell because you get that look. But we're going to be okay." She looked at her brother. He was 10 years old, and he had flour on his sleeve from Elsie's biscuit project that morning, and he had grown visibly since they'd left Red Hollow, and he was sitting on courthouse steps in Cardwell planning fence lines for autumn. "I know," she said. "Do you?" She thought about it, honestly. "I'm getting there." He nodded like this was acceptable. "Good enough." Judge Waverly granted the petition. He did it without ceremony, which Eleanor appreciated, just a clear statement of his ruling and the grounds for it, and what it meant going forward. The petition was approved on an emergency basis, pending a formal review in 60 days, during which time Pemberton would file additional documentation, and the court would verify the conditions at Crowley Ridge Ranch and the children's welfare. In practice, all 5 Whitlock children would remain at the ranch, together, under Gideon Crowley's guardianship. Thaddeus Rusk had no remaining legal claim. Pemberton shook Gideon's hand. He shook Eleanor's hand. He said a few things about the 60-day review that she absorbed carefully and would think about later. Milo shook Pemberton's hand also, without being prompted, which made Pemberton blink slightly with surprise. They were out of the courthouse by noon. Eleanor didn't say much on the ride home. Neither did Gideon. They rode with Milo between them and the afternoon light, going long and gold across the grass and the particular quiet of people who have been through something together and don't need to put words around it immediately. About a mile from the ranch, Milo said, "Can we tell the others when we get there, or do we have to wait?" "We can tell them," Gideon said. "I want to tell Elsie," Milo said. "Can I tell Elsie?" "Go ahead," Eleanor said. He heeled Comet into a trot and pulled ahead of them. And Eleanor watched him go with the particular mix of things she'd been carrying since the courthouse steps relief, and something that was adjacent to grief, and something that was further from either of. Those somethings she still didn't have a name for. "He's a good boy," Gideon said. "He's a complicated boy," Eleanor said. "He does good things." Gideon considered this distinction. Fair enough. They rode for another quarter mile. The ranch gate appeared ahead, and beyond it the barn and the house with the evening light on the windows. "Thank you," Eleanor said. She said it to the road ahead rather than to him, which was easier. "You don't have to. I know I don't have to. I'm choosing to." She glanced at him. "You didn't have to file the petition for all 5 of us. Pemberton probably told you that 2 or 3 of the younger ones would have been an easier case." "He mentioned it," Gideon said. "But you filed for all 5. "Yes." "Why?" Gideon was quiet for a moment. "Because when you came out from those cottonwoods," he said, "the first thing you did was put yourself between me and the children. Not just the younger ones. All of them," he paused. "I wasn't going to be the person who undid that." Eleanor looked at the road. She thought about standing between the rider and the trees with 6 days of exhaustion and almost no food, and the particular desperate clarity of a person who has reduced everything to a single point. "Please, don't tell them we're here. I didn't know you then," she said. "No," he agreed. "You didn't. I would have done the same thing to a bad man." "I know," Gideon said. "That's not the point. The point is you did it." She didn't answer that. They reached the gate. From inside the yard, she could already hear Milo's voice, high and fast with the news he'd been holding the whole ride home. And then Elsie's sound, the specific sound of Elsie processing something that was better than she'd prepared for, and then Henry asking something, and Milo explaining, and Caleb's low voice somewhere in the barn, probably pretending not to listen while listening to every word. Gideon dismounted and held the gate open. Eleanor rode through. That evening, she went through the ranch books again. Not because she needed to, not because there was something urgent, but because it settled her, the same way it had always settled her. The way numbers settled, people who had learned to trust them more than approximations. She sat at the desk in the study with the lamp turned up and the house quiet around her, and she went through the summer accounts with a pencil, noting where they stood and what the next months required. Hay supply, winter feed costs, the south pasture fence Milo had mentioned. 3 of the cattle had been showing signs of something that Gideon had been watching for 2 weeks and would need a veterinarian if it progressed, which was an expense that needed to be planned for. She noted the Alderman farm. Gideon had written them, as he'd said he would. No response yet, but early. She noted the ranch's land holdings, the boundaries, the water access, the grazing rights that had been registered with the county when Gideon bought the property. There was a section along the eastern fence that was described in the original registry as a contested boundary with a neighboring operation called the Denning Spread. She hadn't noticed that before. She looked at it more carefully. The Denning Spread was marked on the county survey as sharing a fence line with Crowley Ridge along the eastern quarter mile. But the registry notation said the boundary had been informally disputed for several years without formal resolution. No court filing, no mediation record, just a notation that the eastern line was uncertain. Eleanor sat back. She read the notation again. Then she went through the water rights section. There was a creek access along the northeast corner, a seasonal creek that ran strong in spring and usually held some water through August in good years. The Crowley rights to that creek access were registered, but the notation for the eastern fence dispute also mentioned access to the creek bed, which meant if the eastern boundary was uncertain, the water access might be too. She set the pencil down. She thought about this for several minutes. Then she got up and went to find Gideon. He was on the porch, as he often was in the evenings, not rocking, not reading, just sitting in the dark and watching the night the way he did. She had asked him once what he was looking at, and he'd said nothing in particular, which she had eventually understood meant everything in general. She sat in the other chair. "Your eastern fence line," she said. He looked at her. "There's a boundary dispute in the registry. With the Denning Spread, you've never resolved it formally." A pause. "No. How long has it been disputed? 7 years, maybe 8. Old Denning and I had an argument about it when I first bought the place. Nothing formal. He put up a fence and I let it sit." "Old Denning," she said. "Who runs it now?" Another pause. "A slightly different quality to this one." "His son," Gideon said. "Harlan Denning." Eleanor looked at him. "Is that a problem?" Gideon was quiet for a moment longer than the question required. "Harlan Denning has been wanting that eastern quarter mile for years," he said. "His father wanted it for grazing access. Harlan wants it for the creek bed. The water rights." "Yes." Eleanor sat with this, "and he's never pushed it legally." "Not yet. He was waiting for me to be in a weaker position." Gideon paused. "A man alone with a struggling ranch and no heirs is a weaker position than a man with other circumstances." Eleanor understood what he hadn't said. A man alone and without family was more vulnerable to a sustained legal pressure campaign than a man with roots, with reasons to dig in. "He'll find out about the petition," she said. "He'll find out soon enough. And he'll know things are different now." "Yes. So he might push before things settle," she said. "Before the 60-day review. Before our position is fully established." Gideon looked at her with the expression she'd come to recognize as something between exasperation and something else, the look of a man who keeps being surprised by the same person and hasn't decided whether to stop being surprised. "How long were you looking at those books?" he said. "An hour. And you found the Denning notation in an hour." "It wasn't hidden," Eleanor said. "It was right there." "I know where it is," Gideon said. "I've been meaning to address it for 3 years." "You should address it now. Before he moves. Pemberton's. Pemberton is already working on the guardianship. You need someone specifically for the land registry." She paused. "Or we handle it through the county surveyor directly. If you request a formal boundary survey, it takes the initiative away from Denning. He can't file a claim while a survey is in progress. The court will defer to the survey result." Gideon stared at her. "It's in the county registry rules," she said. "I read them this afternoon." "When did you read the county registry rules?" "In the courthouse, while you and Pemberton were talking during the recess." She paused. There was a copy on the table in the hall. A very long pause. "You're 13 years old," Gideon said. "You keep saying that," Eleanor said. "I keep meaning it differently each time." She almost smiled. "Almost. Should I request the surveyor or will you?" Gideon looked out at the dark and made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something that wasn't quite a laugh. "I'll write to the surveyor in the morning." "I'll draft the letter tonight," Eleanor said. "You can look at it tomorrow." She stood up, Eleanor. She stopped. "I want you to know something," he said. He said it to the dark rather than to her, which she understood, because some things were easier said that way. "When I filed that petition, all 5, together, I wasn't doing it as a favor. I wasn't doing it because it was the right thing or the legal thing or any particular thing I'd calculated." He paused. "I did it because by that point I couldn't imagine this ranch without all of you in it. And I don't say that to make you feel obligated. I say it because you deserve to know it's true." Eleanor stood at the porch door. She thought about 5 empty rooms. She thought about Pearl at the window the first morning, looking at the barnyard like she owned it. She thought about Milo planning fence lines for autumn. She thought about her mother's voice and her father's laugh and the grave in Red Hollow that she would go back to someday when she was ready. She thought about what it meant to find ground worth standing on. "I know," she said quietly. "I think I knew before you did." She went inside. Behind her, Gideon sat in the dark for a long time. The stars came out above the grassland, the same stars that had been over the cottonwoods and the dry wash in 6 days of open country. And the night was still, and the house had light in its windows, and somewhere inside it, 5 children were settled into sleep, in rooms that were no longer empty. And the ranch held. The letter to the county surveyor went out the next morning. Eleanor had drafted it the night before at the study desk, working by lamplight after the house went quiet, choosing each word with the same care she'd applied to her courtroom statement, specific, factual, nothing that could be read 2 ways. She requested a formal boundary survey of the eastern fence line at Crowley Ridge Ranch, cited the registry notation regarding the unresolved Denning dispute, and noted that the water access along the northeast creek bed was directly implicated in the boundary question. She signed it in Gideon's name, as she'd asked permission to do, and left it on the desk for him to review. He read it at breakfast without sitting down, standing at the counter with his coffee, and when he finished, he looked at her across the kitchen. "You left out one thing," he said. "What?" "The survey fee. You need to request a cost estimate in the same letter, or they'll come back to you before they schedule anything and you lose 2 weeks. Eleanor looked at the letter. "I'll add a line," she said. "I already did," Gideon said. He folded it and put it in his coat. "It goes out this morning." That was how it was between them, by then not dramatic, not sentimental, just 2 people with overlapping competencies working on the same problems without making a production of it. Eleanor had noticed this shift sometime in the 2nd week, and hadn't named it because naming things too early had a way of making them self-conscious and fragile, and she had no interest in fragile. The surveyor's office responded in 4 days. They would schedule the boundary assessment within 3 weeks, pending the court's acknowledgement of the request. Harlan Denning did not file anything in those 4 days, or the week after. Eleanor suspected he'd heard about the survey request through the particular network of county information that moved faster than any official correspondence, and that he'd understood what it meant that the initiative was gone, that the window he'd been watching for had closed before he reached it. She didn't know this for certain, and she didn't say it out loud. She just noted the silence from the eastern fence line and returned to the ranch books. The 60-day review came on a Tuesday in October. The morning was cold and the grass had gone brown at the edges, and Henry had recently developed a cough that Caleb was treating with strong tea and suspicious herbs that smelled like old wood, and that Henry drank without complaint because Caleb told him it would make him tough, which was the exact right thing to say to a 5-year-old boy. They rode to Cardwell again, all of them this time. Gideon hired a wagon for the younger children, and Caleb drove it, and Eleanor rode beside the wagon on the horse. Gideon had been teaching her to handle properly for the past 6 weeks. She wasn't graceful on a horse yet. She was competent, which was what she'd aimed for. The review was less dramatic than the first hearing, which Eleanor had prepared herself for and still found faintly anticlimactic. Pemberton presented the documentation. The court representative who had visited the ranch 2 weeks earlier, a woman named Mrs. Aldgate, brisk and thorough, who had examined the sleeping arrangements and the food stores and the children's general condition with the systematic attention of someone who took her responsibilities seriously, submitted her report. Her report was favorable. Judge Waverly read it, asked Gideon 4 questions, asked Eleanor 2, asked Milo 1 the same question he'd asked before. "Do you want to be there?" And Milo gave the same answer. "Yes," without hesitation, and then looked at Pearl, who was sitting in the front bench beside Caleb and had fallen asleep against his arm. The judge looked at Pearl sleeping for a moment. Then he signed the papers. Permanent guardianship. All 5 Whitlock children. Gideon Crowley, Crowley Ridge Ranch, Cardwell County. Pemberton shook hands with everyone again. Mrs. Aldgate said something to Eleanor about the ranch books that Eleanor had let her look at during the inspection. Something about how she didn't often see accounts kept this clearly in a working ranch household. And Eleanor said, "Thank you," and meant it. Gideon was standing at the courtroom window when Eleanor found him, looking out at the square below with the particular stillness he had when something had happened that he needed a moment with. She stood beside him. "It's done." "Yes," he said. "How does it feel?" He was quiet for a moment. "Like something I should have done years ago," he said. "Except I couldn't have, because you weren't here yet." He paused. "That doesn't make sense." "It makes sense," Eleanor said. He looked at her. "You doing all right?" She thought about it honestly, the way she'd been trying to do things since she arrived at the ranch, not the automatic reassurance, but the actual answer. "I think so," she said. "Ask me again in a week." He almost smiled. "I'll do that." Thaddeus Rusk went to trial in November. Eleanor testified. She had prepared for this differently than she'd prepared for the guardianship, hearing less about architecture, more about endurance. She knew the defense would try to undermine her account, and she knew that being 13 was both her vulnerability and, in a certain light, her argument. A 13-year-old who had led 4 younger children across 6 days of open country on almost nothing was not a child who confused what she'd heard. The defense attorney was a man named Garvey, who was competent and not unkind, and whose strategy was exactly what Eleanor had expected. He tried to frame her as a frightened child who had misunderstood an adult conversation. She let him make the argument. She let him finish. Then she told the jury what she'd heard, in the same order, with the same specificity, for the 3rd time in front of a legal authority. Pearl, $7, the Connolly woman. Elsie, the laundry house. Milo, strong enough to work, and me, a household manager before winter. She said it without her voice, doing the thing it sometimes wanted to do. Garvey tried once more. "Isn't it possible, Miss Whitlock, that you misinterpreted what you heard? That your uncle was making arrangements for the children's care? Not. He said separate them before the end of the month," Eleanor said. "He said it was easier that way. He said children who stay together make trouble." She looked at Garvey steadily. "I was scared, not confused. Those are different things." The courtroom was quiet. Garvey did not ask another question. Silas Brand testified for 2 hours. He was thorough and specific and did not attempt to minimize his own role, which Eleanor respected even though she did not forgive him for it. because respect and forgiveness were different accounting categories, and she had learned to keep her books clean. Thaddeus Rusk was convicted on 3 counts. He received a sentence that would keep him away from the children for longer than they would need him to stay away, which was all Eleanor had ever required of any legal outcome. She walked out of the courthouse into the November cold, and Milo was waiting on the steps with his hands in his pockets, and he looked at her face and said, "Done?" "Done," she said. He nodded. He looked out at the square. Caleb's got the wagon around the side. Pearl threw her biscuit at Henry in the wagon, and now Henry won't sit next to her. Eleanor looked at him. She said he was breathing too loud. I don't know. Milo was already heading down the steps. "Come on. Caleb says if we leave now we can get back before dark." Eleanor stood on the courthouse steps for one more moment. She thought about Thaddeus's study, the lamplight and the scratching pen and the ledger with the names in columns. She thought about what it had cost her to stand in that hallway and hear those words and choose to carry them instead of crumble under them. She thought, it's over. Not simple, not clean, not without cost. But over, she went down the steps. Winter came in hard that year. The creek on the northeast corner froze in December, which settled the water rights question in a practical sense. Frozen water rights were academic water rights, and Harlan Denning apparently concluded the same thing because the boundary survey came back in his favor on a technicality about the original fence placement, and he filed no claim against the water access regardless, which Pemberton attributed to the cost of litigation against a ranch that now had documented roots and legals standing, and a 13-year-old who had twice demonstrated an ability to be extremely clear in front of judges. Eleanor attributed it to the same thing. The cattle did well through winter. 3 of the animals Gideon had been watching covered without veterinary expense, which Eleanor noted in the books with the specific satisfaction of a thing that had been planned for and then not needed. She kept the accounts through December and into the new year, and Gideon reviewed everything she wrote and corrected 2 errors in January 1 arithmetic. One is misread of the feed contract terms and did not make a larger thing of either correction than it deserved, which was the right approach. She was learning. She knew she was learning because she could feel the difference between what she understood in October and what she understood in February, and the difference had texture and weight and specific names. Henry's cough went away by January. Pearl turned 4 in February and received from Caleb a small wooden horse he'd carved himself over the winter evenings, which Pearl named after the rag doll she'd finally stopped carrying. Sometime in December, she set the rag doll on the windowsill in her room and switched her allegiance to the wooden horse without ceremony. The way small children transfer devotions, completely and without apology. Elsie learned to make biscuits that didn't burn. This took until March, and there were several intermediate batches of varying quality, and Caleb ate every one of them without comment, which Elsie eventually recognized as generosity and thanked him for, seriously, in the kitchen one afternoon, which made Caleb look out the window for a moment before he said she was welcome. Milo reset the entire south pasture fence line before spring. He did it over 6 weeks, working with Gideon and then increasingly working alongside Gideon rather than behind him, learning the difference between a properly set post and one that looked set until the cattle leaned on it. He made mistakes. He reset 3 posts twice. He drove 1 post crooked on a Friday afternoon and stared at it for 2 minutes, and then said a word he shouldn't have said loudly enough for Gideon to hear, and Gideon looked at the post and said, "Pull it and try again," without addressing the word, which was both the correct teaching approach and an acknowledgement that some moments required one priority and not the other. Eleanor watched all of it. Not hovering, she had things of her own that needed doing, but watching in the way you watch when you've been responsible for people so long that watching is just part of how you breathe. An automatic function you can't quite switch off, even when it's no longer necessary for survival. She was working on switching it off. It was slow work. Spring brought the Alderman Hay contract, which Eleanor had drafted and Gideon had reviewed and sent in March, and the alderman operation turned out to be everything the county maps had suggested: good land, good management, hay that stored well and kept its nutrition. The first delivery came in April on a wagon driven by a man named Tom Alderman, who was approximately Gideon's age, and who looked at the ranch with the specific eye of a farmer assessing another man's operation and said, Without preamble, you've got good drainage on the east side. A lot of spreads this size let that go. Gideon said, "My bookkeeper noticed it." Tom Alderman looked around the yard, which at that moment contained Henry trying to get Caleb's gray mule to accept a wildflower he'd picked, and Elsie hanging washing on the line, and Pearl sitting on the porch rail, watching everything with the proprietorial air she'd developed. "How many kids you got?" Tom asked. "5, Gideon said. Tom looked at him. "Good for you," he said simply, and went back to unloading the wagon. Eleanor, who had been standing near the barn door close enough to hear, went back to the books without saying anything. "Good for you." She turned that over in her head for the rest of the afternoon. Not because it required analysis, it didn't. It was a simple thing, simply said, but because it landed somewhere in her chest that she hadn't known, was still waiting to be landed in. The acknowledgement from a stranger who had no stake in it and no reason to say it, beyond the fact that it was true. She closed the ledger at the end of the day and went to find Gideon at the south fence. She didn't have anything specific to say. She just walked to where he was working and stood beside him in the late afternoon and didn't say anything, and he didn't say anything either. And after a few minutes of standing in the quiet with the spring grass going green around them and the ranch settled and solid at their backs, she said, "Tom Alderman seems reliable." "He does," Gideon agreed. "His hay is better quality than what you were buying. You'll see it in the winter feed numbers. I expect so." A pause. The wind moved through the grass. "I've been thinking about going back to Red Hollow," Eleanor said. "To the grave. Before summer." Gideon didn't look up from the fence line. "I'll take you," he said. "You don't have to." "I know," he said. "I'll take you." She looked out at the east pasture where the boundary survey had been completed and the contested line resolved and the question closed. "I want to take all of them. Let them say goodbye properly." "Then we'll all go," Gideon said. She nodded. They went in May, the whole household, on a clear, warm morning, with the country looking better than it had any right to in Eleanor's memory of riding through it in flight. 6 days of fear going in one direction had taken on different proportions. Now the landscape was just landscape, just grass and sky, and the occasional cluster of cottonwoods along a dry creek, and she looked at it from the wagon seat and thought about the child who had moved through it with a flour sack and 4 smaller people, and somewhere she still was that child, and somewhere she was something else now. And the 2 versions of her occupied the same body, without particular conflict. They stood at the graves, both of them, her parents buried side by side in the Red Hollow cemetery with the headstones that Thaddeus had actually paid for, which was the one decent thing he'd done, and Eleanor acknowledged it privately and without gratitude, and she held Pearl's hand and watched Milo stand very still in front of his father's marker, with the particular stillness that men learn from. Grief when they are too young to have learned it and learn it anyway. Henry asked if their mother could hear them. Caleb, who was standing at the back of the group, said, "Tell her anyway. It doesn't matter if she hears, it matters that you say it." Henry nodded and told his mother about the mule and the wildflowers, and the fact that he could tie a fence knot now, a proper one, and Gideon had said so. Eleanor did not say anything at the grave. She had said everything she needed to say in the 6 days she'd walked across open country to keep what her parents had made. That was her statement. She had made it with her feet and her choices, and the particular refusal of a 13-year-old girl to let the world reduce her family to a column of names and prices in a ledger. She thought her mother would have understood that. She thought her father would have been proud in the way he was always proud of her, which was quietly and completely, and without making it into a speech. She stood at the graves, and she let herself feel it all, the loss and the anger and the relief and the gratitude and the complicated mix of things that had no single name, and then she took Pearl's hand and turned back toward the wagon. "Ready?" Gideon said. "Ready," she said. They went home. That summer, Eleanor turned 14. It did not feel dramatically different from being 13, which she had suspected would be the case. She was taller. She was better on a horse. She had finished the county land registry manual that she'd started in February and had a clear understanding of Crowley Ridge Ranch's legal position on every registered dimension boundary, water, grazing, access road, which was more than most adults who ran ranches could say, and she knew it without arrogance, just as a fact about what she'd chosen to spend her time on. Gideon gave her a proper account ledger for her birthday. Leather-bound, with her initials pressed into the cover. Milo gave her a pocket knife with a good blade. Caleb made a cake that was better than the biscuits had ever been. Pearl gave her the rag doll from the windowsill, which was the most serious gift Pearl had ever given anyone, because Pearl did not give that doll lightly. And Eleanor understood this and kept it on her own windowsill, where Pearl could see it when she came into the room. Elsie, who had been thinking about it for 3 weeks, gave her a letter. It was short. 7-year-olds don't write long letters. But it said, "You kept us. I know you did. I know it was hard. I'm glad it was you." Eleanor read it twice and then folded it and put it in the ledger between the pages for August. She kept it there for years. One evening in late summer, when the heat had broken and the air had the particular quality it gets in August, when the worst of summer is over and something easier is coming, Eleanor and Gideon sat on the porch after the children were in bed. It had become a habit, without being declared a habit, just a thing that happened at the end of long days. The two of them on the porch, with the dark country beyond the fence, and the lamp going low inside, and nobody requiring anything of either of them for a while. Pearl had finally stopped waking in the night. This had happened sometime in July, quietly without announcement. Eleanor had noticed the absence of Pearl's footsteps in the hall, and waited 3 nights to be sure before she let herself believe it. The nightmares that Pearl had never had words for, the ones that made her cry in a way that was exhausting for her small body, they had simply receded, the way bad things do when they've been replaced by enough good things for long enough. Eleanor didn't know exactly when that had happened. She wished she'd marked the day. "Can I ask you something?" she said to Gideon. He looked at her. "When you saw me at the cottonwoods," she said. "The first time. When I stepped out and asked you not to tell, what did you actually think?" Gideon was quiet for a moment. "I thought, this child is exhausted and terrified and absolutely not going to show me either." Eleanor looked at the dark. "I was both," she said. "I know, I wasn't sure it wasn't showing." "It wasn't," he said. "Not to someone who wasn't paying close attention." He paused. "I was paying close attention." She thought about that. About what it meant that he had seen through the composure she'd constructed so carefully, and had helped anyway, not because she'd fooled him, but in spite of not fooling him. "Why did you really do it?" she said. "Not the reasons you've said before. The real one." He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "After Margaret and Samuel died, I went through about 2 years of being a man with nothing to lose. You know what that's like? When everything that mattered is already gone, and you're just moving, doing the tasks. Not because they mean anything, but because you can't think of a reason to stop." Eleanor listened. "I came out of it," he said slowly. "But I came out of it. And when I did, I thought I'm not going to live the rest of my life in a house that stays empty because I'm afraid of losing something again." He looked out at the grassland. "Then you stepped out from those cottonwoods, and you were the most determined, scared person I'd ever seen. And I thought," he stopped. He looked at his hands. "I thought, those children need somewhere safe to be. And I have somewhere." "That's still the same answer," Eleanor said. "I know," he said, "but I mean it differently now." She looked at him. Then he said, "I meant I had a practical thing to offer. Space, food, cover from riders." He paused. "Now, I can't imagine the ranch being what it is without all of you in it. And I don't know exactly when that changed, but it did." Eleanor sat with this for a while. She thought about the question she'd asked herself on the first night, sitting on the top stair in the dark after she'd let herself cry for exactly 5 minutes. One night, she'd said. And she'd known even then, somewhere below thought, that one night wasn't going to be enough. She'd been right. One night had turned into a boundary survey, and a guardianship petition, and burned biscuits, and a pocket knife, and a 7-year-old's letter folded into August's accounts, and Pearl sleeping through the night, and Milo's fence line holding through its first winter, and Henry knowing how to tie a proper knot. One night had turned into this. "I want to tell you something," she said. "And I need you to not make it into more than it is, because if you do, I'll probably stop saying it, and I don't want to stop saying it." Gideon waited. "You gave us ground," she said, "real ground. Not just the legal kind, not just the physical kind. The kind that means when something comes at you, you have somewhere to stand." She paused. "I didn't know what that felt like before. I thought survival meant always being ready to run. I thought you stayed safe by not staying anywhere." She looked at the house behind them, the lit windows, the sound of Milo's voice from somewhere inside, talking to himself the way he did before sleep. You were the first person who showed me that wasn't true. Gideon said nothing. She'd asked him not to make it into more than it was, and he was honoring that, which was exactly what she'd needed. All right, he said after a moment. Thank you for telling me. Don't thank me. All right, he said again. The lamp inside went low. The grassland stretched out dark and quiet beyond the fence, the same grassland she'd looked at from the porch on the second night and thought, I can see why he stayed. I can see what he was keeping this for. She had meant the landscape. She understood now she'd meant more than that. The county registry, she said, because she needed to return to something practical before the evening got away from her. I want to file the Alderman Hay contract as a registered business agreement. It protects us if the terms are ever disputed, and it establishes the ranch as operating at a certain level, which matters for credit if we ever need it. Gideon looked at her. Tonight? Tomorrow. I'll draft the filing request tonight. You're 14, he said. 15 in 11 months, she said. The almost smile, the one she'd been cataloging since the first week. I'll look at the draft in the morning. I know you will, she said. She stood up from the chair. Good night. Good night, Eleanor. She went inside. She went to the study and sat at the desk and pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began to draft the filing request in her clear, careful hand, the lamp turned up enough to work by. The house quiet around her with the specific quiet of people sleeping safe. She worked for an hour. Then she set the pencil down and looked at the paper and thought about what her mother would have said if she could have seen the desk, the ledger, the ranch books, in their proper order on the shelf. The bedroom upstairs with Pearl's rag doll on the windowsill. She thought her mother would have said, You found it. The thing worth standing for. Most people spend their whole lives looking. She thought her father would have said, Show me the numbers. She almost laughed. She gathered the papers and put them in order and closed the ledger and turned down the lamp. She went upstairs. She looked in on Pearl, first flat on her back, arms out, the complete boneless sleep of a 4-year-old who has no reason to be afraid of the dark. The wooden horse Caleb had made was on the pillow beside her. Henry was curled around his blanket with his face pressed into it and his feet sticking out the other end. Elsie was reading by the small lamp on her nightstand, and she looked up when Eleanor looked in, and Eleanor shook her head slightly, not yet. Put it down, and Elsie put the book down with the expression of a child who is going to pick it back up the moment the door closes, which she absolutely was. Milo was already asleep, on his stomach, one arm hanging off the bed. He had calluses on his hands now from the fence line. Eleanor had noticed this last week and had not said anything about it, because there was nothing to say about it, really. It was just what happened when a boy worked the ground hard enough and long enough. She went to her own room. She sat on the edge of the bed, in the dark, and looked at the window where the stars were visible, above the grassland, and she thought about all of it, the ledger, and the cottonwoods, and the dry wash, and the courtroom, and the graves in red, hollow and. The biscuits that burned, and Elsie's letter and Pearl sleeping through the night. She thought about what she'd learned that she hadn't known before. She had thought, for a long time, that courage was the thing that let you keep moving. That it was a fuel, something you burned in order to stay ahead of whatever was coming. She understood now that she'd had it backward. Courage wasn't what let you run. Courage was what let you stop. It was the hardest thing she'd ever done. Harder than 6 days in open country. Harder than a courtroom. Harder than reading letters with her siblings' names and prices in them stopping had been the hardest thing. Planting her feet on someone else's ground and deciding it was worth staying on and letting herself want it. Letting herself want it. That was the part nobody warned you about. Not the running, not the fighting, not the legal proceedings, and the evidence and the arguments in front of judges. The wanting. The moment when you allowed yourself to believe that the ground you'd found was real and solid and worth the risk of losing. She had been 13 years old, exhausted and terrified, and carrying Pearl on her hip, and she had stepped out from the cottonwoods into the open. Not because she'd known it would work out, because she'd had no other move. And that was the thing about courage that nobody told you. It didn't require certainty. It only required the next step, just the one in front of you. Just that, she lay back on the bed. The stars moved in the window the way they always did, slow and indifferent and enormous. The same stars that had been over the dry wash, and the 6 days of open country, and the courthouse steps in Cardwell, and the graves in Red Hollow. She thought, "We're still here." She thought Pearl slept through the night. She thought Milo's fence line held through winter. She closed her eyes. Outside, Crowley Ridge Ranch settled into the dark, the way it always did the horses in the barn, the cattle in the south pasture, the fence line solid and set, the creek in the northeast corner running quiet through the summer night. 5 rooms that had been empty. Not anymore, not ever again.